No, it's just so when it gets good back to the meeting. It's okay. I say it's not really just you just I did it yesterday. Actually, go for it. Maybe because they represent the national investigation. So. I don't know, yes. So they put it, they'd already communicated. If they came in and that's in the house and the base and then they established.
Welcome to us. No, because we don't. Okay, seems like nobody's on it. So we only ever see this. Good afternoon. 2 minutes late, I'm calling to order the May 7th meeting of ENRAC. Welcome, everybody, and some of us did not get the rest of the day.
Listen, we did not plan this.
You'll never put that.
We did not plan this.
So, roll call, please.
Okay, for the record, I'm Ginger Adair, Environmental Management Director. The roll call, Ms. Lammers,
Here.
Ms. Gao. Here. Ms. Anderson,
Here.
Ms. Brosmer,
Here.
Mr. Burbank. Mr. Fitzsimmons has sent his regrets. Mr. Hoblich is online, and once we're done here, if you guys would want to vote to let him participate, he's waiting patiently. Ms. Jameson?
Here.
Mr. Geronimo? Mr. Lights? Mr. Momberg?
Here.
Ms. Morrissey?
Here.
Mr. Surratt?
Here.
And Ms. Whittick. All right, so that's a quorum, and if we could get Mr. Hoblich, that would be awesome.
Would someone like to make a motion?
I move to include Mr. Hoblich online.
Motion made by Tyler Malberg, seconded by Bliss Jameson. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Hi, John.
Hi, everybody. Thank you.
Welcome.
I would, again, because we're going to talk about the minutes, but because we're using the recording to develop the minutes, I'd like to let everyone know we have some visitors. We have Belinda Williams Collins with the City of DeLand. We have Mallory Tatum with Zev Cohen and Jordan Munsey with GTA. And do we want to actually say which staff is here? I think we should.
Fire and Growth and Resource Management Director. Chris Ryan, Assistant County Attorney. Morgan Spank, Assistant County Attorney. He did.
Samantha West, Sustainability and Resilience Manager.
We have Chelsea Moulton with Environmental.
Thank you very much. A reminder, because we are in our recording and experimentation with AI to, as Ginger just said, state your name, have the microphone on when you speak. And also, the air conditioning is broken in the room. So we have one fan on that is loud. John, can you hear us well enough?
I hear everybody loud and clear. Sorry about the air conditioning.
Thank you. It's not too bad yet. So we can leave that on for now. Thank you very much. And next we have the minutes. Did everyone have an opportunity to review them? Oh, Ginger.
I just wanted to let you know, so you have two versions of the minutes. You have the, what looks like actual minutes, and then you had the sort of just transcript word vomit version of the minutes. So we want to talk about that. But in the smaller version of the minutes, we already did find some errors. Some folks who are listed as present weren't present. We're going to fix that. Brianna's name is misspelled. So we have a couple of corrections already. But any other corrections would be great. And then a discussion, well, I guess first on our agenda is the discussion of the new format. So you got both versions. Everybody like the idea that this is a shorter version?
And up first at bat, Ms. Whittick.
I like the shortened version one, and then two, the AI one is entertaining to read. Well, it was just entertaining to read.
Mr. Burbank, then Mr. Urban.
Minutes work well also, and we will train ourselves as software changes itself also, whatever the software's name is.
Clay Urban, after y'all have finished the discussions on the minutes, I would like to introduce an item before we get into the actual meat of the agenda to discuss some legislative issues that have come up.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any correction to the minutes? I'm actually asking this before we call for a vote. No? Okay, we'd entertain a motion to accept the minutes with the noted corrections that Ginger made. Do we have a second? Okay, motion made by Tom Burbank, seconded by Jack Surratt to accept the minutes from the April meeting. All those in favor? Any opposed?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion carries. The minutes are approved. We have another visitor. Should we note the visitor?
Good afternoon. Paulo Soria, Senior Assistant County Attorney. I'm just listening in.
Okay, thank you, Paolo Soria, and also Kelly Constantino we have in the room with us. Thank you very much. Clay Urban, or do we want to discuss a new format any more than we already have? Two people made comments, that was it. Done? Okay. Clay, would you like to update us on the legislative session?
Yes, as everyone is aware, this legislative session has been kind of hectic, and there's been a bunch of bills that have come, gone, modified. Staff was just made aware of some recent changes to Senate Bill 180, which resurrects the old Senate Bill 250 from several years ago. And for those of you who were not on the Environmental Natural Resource Advisory Committee, that was the language that said that if there was a hurricane that made landfall, no local government impacted by its landfall could enact more stringent land development regulations, comp plan, etc. So there's one that's pending this approval from the governor that would do that. And it's retroactive back to August 1st, 2024. So what that would mean is that our stormwater regulations that we got approved, because they are considered more stringent than what was originally in place, would be null and void. And we would have to go back and redo the whole thing again once this period is over. Paolo's online and Chris is online because God knows I need an attorney to get me through the rest.
At the least. Do the attorneys, I mean, that seems pretty straightforward, but I'm sure the attorneys would like to say something.
Clarify.
Yeah, so essentially, as Clay said, was correct. What,
Excuse me, was it signed already?
it was not signed yet, no.
Okay, so citizens could still make.
Could still petition the governor to veto, yes, correct.
Thank you very much. That's an important thing.
So,
to
so
know.
this is a bill that for all intents and purposes, we didn't think was going to pass. In fact, the Thousand Friends of Florida thought it was dead in the water. So it passed kind of last minute. There was a little horse trading back and forth. On Friday, it passed. The engrossed enrolled versions were presented on Monday. And in going over them today, we discovered this language. And it impacts us if we try to make any amendments to comp plans or land development regulations, pardon me, or enact a moratorium. Up until, as Clay said, it's retroactive to August 1st of last year, but it goes until October 1st of 2027. So it's similar language to, as he mentioned, what SB 250 did back in 2023. There is an additional provision, however, that says any future storm, which is declared an emergency by the as a federal disaster declaration, pardon me, any county that's located within 100 miles of landfall will have the same provision acted for 1 year after that as well. So again, we would be prohibited from enacting any LDR or comp plan amendment that's more restrictive during that time as well.
Thank you, Chris. I
So
guess,
I just make sure I understand. So if it passes.
If it passes.
Or if the governor signs it.
Yes.
So anything from August 1st of 2024 through
October
October
1st of 2027.
7, we can't do anything more restrictive. And then if another storm comes within 100 miles of the county, a year
A
after
year
that.
after that, yes, correct.
So
Going landfall, correct. Going forward.
so it resets.
It does, yes.
So what that means is that,
We can't propose or enact.
Right.
So we
And-
could still do the work here. And in fact, the recent LID is unimpacted by this because it wasn't an actual restriction, it was voluntary. And but for that but for the fact that we chose to do it voluntarily, it would have been void as well.
no. It's just very unfortunate with so much of a focus on flooding and on things like the April 1st, I believe it was April 1st, requiring stem wall construction in the floodplain, that some citizens were very pleased to see those kinds of, it's pretty great. Thank you. And I shouldn't editorialize, but it's rather shocking.
But as you mentioned, though, it hasn't been signed by the governor yet, so it's not effective currently. But if it is signed, it does become law, that it would be retroactive to
Do we-
last year.
Do we know when that will hit his desk?
I believe he has 14 days as of Monday, since it occurred technically during regular session, which was extended until June 5th. So
And-
that's
Do you happen to know which county or counties or districts or the sponsor, the sponsor of these changes?
was that DeSiglia?
The Sigley's name is,
Thank you very much. Bill,
So last time it was in effect, it changed halfway through and they reduced the distance or something?
Last time they made it named counties. Additionally, originally it was a certain, it was 150 miles of landfall, which is going to be what the one going forward would be. Then they changed it to be specifically named counties, which removed some of the named counties. This time it's specific to as to 3 hurricanes and it's the counties named in the federal declaration of emergency. And it was for Helene, Milton, and Debbie. And that pretty much encompasses every single county in the entire state.
please.
Sorry, I'm processing this information and you're saying county, so that's everything within the county, all the cities
The
with.
cities within the county as well, yes.
Donna,
Always get this wrong. Since I wasn't here when this first was proposed, I'm trying to figure out where it came from. What the reason behind it might be. And the only thing I can think of is some of the experiences that other states have had where the area was destroyed by a natural disaster and the local government came in and refused to allow rebuilding except by new codes that made it harder to rebuild. So is that what's happening here? Is that what this is?
I can't pretend to know the motivation. I'm sure we can find that out. But we do already have those laws on the books in some cases, and Claire is going to say something about that.
So it wouldn't have been necessary anyway. I mean, if that was the reason.
It was a concern that because of the hurricanes, local governments would put in rules and regulations that would have difficulty on those trying to rebuild. Now, the fact is, if you submitted your application for building permit to repair and the code was just in ordinance process, not finalized, you would be still subject to the old codes. Again, I think what you're seeing is that what Chris said, this applies to all 67 counties and all of the cities throughout the state of Florida. So basically, everyone has to go back to the code that was in place August 1, 2024. So that means any moratorium, any increases in stormwater, floodplain, et cetera, has to go back to what was originally in August 1st, 2024. I do have to say that our requirement for stem wall is not a code change. That was an interpretation of the floodplain regulations by myself as the Growth and Resource Management Director, so I do not believe that's applicable here.
I'm like Bliss, I'm also processing this and thinking how it impacts resiliency in a state where we have rising water all around us.
From staff's perspective, we see it retards our efforts to go and proceed on with any lessons that we've learned from the storm. To me, I think Ms. Brosmer hit it right on the head. If the bill had said, if you were destroyed by these hurricanes, the code that was in place shall apply to your property to allow you to reconstruct as was previously constructed. That would have solved the problem without going through all of these machinations of the dates and making things null and void. And
is that something that the county's lobbyists could suggest?
Yes, but right now it's going to the governor, and at that point, and candidly, county and city lobbyists in Tallahassee have a voice that's not really being heard.
Bill?
Is it only the stormwater that we've done since then, or are there other things that we've finished?
We completed quite a few changes, but for the most part, most of them have been relaxation of standards. And the LID, because it is voluntary, is not considered a harsh increase or mandatory requirement. So therefore, it's still going forward. And Carol was just looking, you go to Muni Code, it's already up.
Then Wendy.
Thank you. Part of this also is, as I understand, is a reaction, is to prevent knee-jerk reactions by local governments that don't really know what they're doing. They're going to just make some quick changes, real not right here now, sometimes for political reasons, and they'd rather not see that happen. What was that number again, Bill?
180.
180, thank you.
If somebody can just educate me a little bit, when we have, let's say, a PUD, I'm looking at Jessica for this. When we have a PUD coming before the council or before city commission, that's an ordinance, right? It's an ordinance. So
Not necessarily. It can be an ordinance in some. This is Paul Soria, Senior Assistant County Attorney. It's a development order, so in the county, they're passed by resolution.
Okay, so my question was really, if a PUD seems to sometimes operate outside of all of the regular regulations. Which is good and bad. Sometimes you get better stuff in a PUD and then you gotta, a little bit of negotiating goes on. So would this law, if the governor signs it, allow a county or a city to continue those kinds of negotiations in a PUD, given that those kind of remain the Wild West?
Wendy's looking at me, but then I'll defer to anyone else.
Okay.
I think yes, because a large benefit of most PD ordinances is a public benefit. And so what that public benefit scope ends up being by the applicant could be LID, could be increased stormwater, it could be all of that. It can't be an illegal or unconstitutional condition. So that's the level of if they agree and they want to do it, great. If a PD got to the final stage and county council said, we won't approve this unless you provide this, that's above and beyond the rules. I think that's different.
That's correct. And the SB 180 accounts for those types of processes. It specifically excludes associated applications initiated by a private party other than the county or municipality, and that the property that is subject to the application is owned by the initiating private party. So they're talking about those applications, PUDs, land development code changes, and comprehensive plan amendment changes that are applicant initiated, which are an exception to the provision. So an applicant can initiate something that would have the effect of being more restrictive through some condition or something like that. That's completely allowable by the proposed language of the bill.
Bill Lights?
So if it goes through 2027, can we still work on all this, but just put it on the shelf?
Yes. That's what we did during SB 250. It can't, like, we are prohibited from enacting or technically proposing, so we can't have like a proposed ordinance, but we can do the work. We can, do all the legwork. We just can't kind of do anything official with it.
Tyler?
So I was just skimming through the language in the bill to kind of see what's in it. There's a lot in this bill. There's a lot of stuff on local political subdivisions, so local municipalities, having emergency management plans, coordinating those emergency management plans regionally. There are requirements for contractors who have cranes that are in the path of a hurricane to have an emergency plan for lowering the cranes, dealing with the potential damage of that. So this is one of those bills that it's like a trash can. It's full of a lot of different stuff, and some of the stuff looks like it's probably going to have pretty good potential value, and some of it looks like it could have some pretty big implications as well. And I think that it's going to be a challenge to not expect it to get signed. I mean, as a committee, we need to just expect that this is kind of the law of the land, and until it's not, my opinion, at least, is operate like it's going to get signed, because there's so much in it. It looks like it's a very, what's the report barrel type of bill.
And just to echo what Chris Ryan said a little bit earlier, right now, we've got some very clear directions from our council to proceed forward. We do not see any need to put on the brakes and stop. We can continue going forward, because the fact is, sooner or later, we will actually be able to govern ourselves again. And when that occurs, we want to be able to proceed on with the work that y'all gotten done. It will just be one real long council. We may have to ask for an extension beyond the 6-hour limitation.
If I can tag on one last thought, there are other ways that we can still look at. So flooding is the concern. We can still look at what the causes of flooding are. We can still look at what solutions are that can happen before 2027. And one of them is changing flood maps. Changing the FEMA map doesn't change the regulation, it doesn't change the process, but it could make things more accurate and prevent development of flood-prone places. So that's something that, I think the county still has a lot of levers to pull, and I don't see it as doom and gloom. I just think I have to operate in that mindset.
Jessica?
I just wanted to echo that. What I think a focus, one, I want to read this more in depth because it's crazy, but the focus we've had on the basin management plans and all of the things that the county is doing can still proceed, which is great in terms of improvements. And I do think we kind of talked about how there are some standards already in the code that give us some leeway for review. Like Clay said about the interpretation of stem walls. So I think there is still some beneficial path forward.
For, Clay mentioned it, but for Tom and John and Michelle, I think you weren't here. Donna, maybe you weren't either. When SB 250 happened and was similar in what it was doing to us, we all agreed with Clay. We agreed with what Jessica said, with what Tyler said, that we should keep going, that it was important to keep doing this work. If anybody has a different view, speak up now, but I think that there's a lot of value to us continuing to our deliberations.
And this is Paulo again. If you recall in SB 250, that was a passed bill. So the governor signed the bill that was basically identical. And what changed is that during a follow-up special session, the scope of that provision of SB 250 was narrowed to certain identified counties in the Gulf area. So it was a passed and enacted bill, and it was changed in a later special session. So that's when it no longer applied to Volusia County. So, that's.
Thank you, Paul.
You're right.
Okay. With that said, are we ready to discuss how many folks watched or attended the April 15th council meeting? And same question for yesterday's council meeting. Okay, fair number of us. Who would like to make any comments? Ginger, did you want to begin?
I can make a recap, but whatever order you want us to proceed is fine.
Why don't you do that?
Okay. So at the April 15th meeting was the continuation of the discussion of the 7 strategies. Remember that it was heard earlier and it got cut off because of the 6-hour council timeframe. So April 15th, we were back there on that discussion. The 7 strategies again were things that the council had asked for staff to look at in lieu of the development moratorium. The long and short of it on the things that applied to us. The 2 things that really applied to us were the suggestion that we should not allow any wetland impacts in the county, and then the suggestion that we should not allow the use of mitigation banks to mitigate for wetland impacts. So Clay did the presentation on April 15th, and the result was that, one, I'd like to say this out loud, that Councilmember Santiago said that we've been doing amazing work on avoidance and minimization of wetland impacts, particularly on residential. The data that we showed, really indicated that we're working with folks to reduce those impacts. And so that's, Keith and his staff doing a great job. And so they voted to have ENRAC move wetlands up in the queue for discussion and to come up with ways to further reduce and minimize impacts to wetlands, primarily on residential, like new subdivisions and commercial. But they suggested that we look at all of the provisions and bring that back to them for suggestions. So I think that that was a good result. So we've talked about wetlands multiple times. It was in 2023, the last time we talked about wetlands. So my suggestion to the group is that we follow the council's direction, go back and look at wetlands at our next meeting. We'll be able to tell you where we left off, what's left to do. They said both chapter 72 and chapter 50. So the work we did before was really only looking at chapter 72. So if you all agree and vote to do that, we'll bring that back in June. Kind of where we are, what's left to do, have that conversation. So that was April 15th. And then at yesterday's meeting, they in fact adopted the comp plan amendment for low impact development. So that was the last step before the low impact development program can go into effect. The effective date would be June 7th of this year. And so that is all done. There was discussion about whether it should be hybrid or mandatory. They voted to leave it completely voluntary. But that if we don't have folks taking advantage of it, that several of the members were definitely willing to relook at the LID and decide if some of those things should be mandatory. There was a pretty lively discussion about that, but in the end, they adopted it, or they passed the comp plan amendment, all voluntary, and knowing what we know now, maybe that was maybe that was a good thing. So yeah, that's my synopsis.
Question, because some people have asked, some people outside the committee, if putting SB 180 aside, if we were to bring back a hybrid approach to low impact development, I know that there was staff time required to be able to bring that back. What is the estimated kind of staff time if that were to happen?
We would have to basically rewrite the LID guidebook because it's completely written around the fact that you have to pick 4 of these things and 2 of these things, and here are the incentives if you do this and that and the other. If some of those BMPs were mandatory, originally we had talked about hybrid. We were saying some of the site design BMPs would be mandatory, and then you would have still this menu approach of the stormwater BMPs. It would be a complete rewrite. And so you're not looking at an insignificant amount of time.
6 months to a year. Thank you. Any additional comments on the 4:15 and 5-6 meetings? Liz.
Was there anything else said about not using, what you say, mitigation banks? Can you?
There really
expand
was
on
not
that?
an additional discussion on April 15th about the mitigation banks at the April 2nd meeting. The legal department and Clay did a really good job explaining about how the state really preempts the use of the type of mitigation you can use for an impact. And so I think the council recognized, based on all of that research, that they don't have the ability to say you can't use a mitigation bank. We are preempted from that by state law. So they did not discuss that again on the April 15th meeting.
Thank you. Jessica?
A little, I would say, tied into the topic today. Was there any, and I missed the second meeting, but from the April 15th discussion, I know Santiago's last point was kind of, let's also implement the avoidance and minimization on fill. As kind of that aspect. Was there any further discussion?
Yeah, good point. He, I think, liked the way we do avoidance and minimization for wetlands and suggested that we apply maybe a similar metric to fill and also to tree removal. So that when we get back to trees, I think that would be, something to make sure that we pay attention to at that time.
Clay?
The other thing that we wanted to make sure that the council were aware of is many of the things that they were saying in regards to limiting fill, limiting impact to wetlands, encouraging tree preservation and everything else are already wrapped up in our LID standards. And from my perspective, what we were trying to say to them is, let's get 2 or 3 of these LID projects through. Let's go ahead and look at their success from both the applicant and the county's perspective to evaluate it. And the other aspect about fill on the site, I think there's a real big misconception. When you see the earth moving equipment out there and they're moving things around, it doesn't necessarily mean that fill has been brought on the site. And unfortunately, That's what I believe many of the folks who are concerned about fill being brought on the site is their issue is not necessarily with the fill. Their issue is with the disturbance and the removal of the trees and the existing vegetation on the site. And so if we can utilize LID to help minimize that and offer an opportunity so that aside from the cost benefit of tearing down trees, they also get an additional lift with the LID standards and potential density bonuses and flexibility with lot configurations. That may prove to be enough so we don't have to necessarily go into a bigger arena.
I'm glad you brought that up that way. It seems like there are two groups of, and this is Melissa talking, there are two groups of two very vocal groups, the people who've been impacted by flooding, who don't like the fill because of what they believe that causes on their property, and the group of people that are very upset about clear cutting and see the fill as something that, and some of that overlaps, but LID is an answer for both of those groups. It's a common point where right now there may not be that unifying factor. But they're both very vocal at council meetings, and I know that that has affected council to a degree.
So just to tie that up, do we want a motion to bring wetlands back at the next meeting and take the council's direction to look at that next? I don't know if we need a motion for that or not, but.
Wendy, then Jessica.
I would like to make a motion that we bring wetlands back as soon as we finish floodplain hazards, that we should finish what we started with floodplain hazard and then wetlands comes next.
Yes, sorry, I should have been more clear. I believe we're going to finish the floodplain hazards today. That's my real hope. And then move on to wetlands. But yes, I agree. Let's not stop something and start something new.
So Wendy Anderson moved that we take up wetlands as soon as we have concluded floodplain, and Tom Burbank seconded it. All those in favor? Anybody opposed to that? Motion, John?
I was an aye. Sorry, I didn't get mute off quick enough.
Okay, thank you. Motion carries. Thank you very much. And then Jessica, you were next up.
As we get back into the discussion on wetlands, I know this group long ago, right, focused on 72 versus 50, with the council direction to look at 50, especially as it relates to wetlands. Do we need to talk about the structure of local government involvement, education, any of that as it relates to 50? That's always been our primary concern as a group, I feel.
Sure, and we can have that discussion right now if you want, or we can talk about it when we get to wetlands, but it's actually timely. If this SB 180 doesn't get signed, we had planned on taking the Chapter 50 stormwater changes to the cities for review. And the way we thought about structuring that is by using the roundtable of elected officials, and they have a flooding subcommittee. And so the plan was to present at that committee and then get the city's comments that way. And I think that's really appropriate for the stormwater changes. The committee, the subcommittee may not be as appropriate if we're talking about wetland, proposed wetland changes, but the roundtable is probably a really good way to reach out to all of those cities. So that's kind of what we're planning to do.
Thank you, John.
The EPA's proposed a new definition of wetlands, which narrows. Have we looked at what impact that might have on both what we're going to do or, what we're doing in the future?
Bill?
That will only apply to the federal, the state. It will remain the same, and we're obligated to follow the state.
I mean, it's a Clean Water Act at the federal level, but doesn't the state and take a look at that and enact series of regulations? And then we, as a county, looks at the state and, I mean, how does that filter down?
So there are different definitions. And so, what Bill was saying is the federal definition could potentially change. It would limit the extent of waters of the US. That definition is already different than the definition that the state uses to delineate wetlands. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that the state could say, well, we want to change our definition also. That would impact us if they did that. It's not, the definition of waters of the US has changed back and forth several times over the last, I don't know, decade or so, and the state definition hasn't. So we're proceeding as if the state definition remains the same, and that is what we rely on in our ordinance as well.
Okay. I guess that concludes our discussion of the council meetings and our work plan, our immediate work plan. Yes. So we can now take up the old business of flood hazard management.
Hey, so Samantha West, Sustainability and Resilience Manager. About a week or so ago, we sent you the model floodplain ordinance from the state. I have gone through and compared it with our current ordinance. It is substantially similar. The changes that, if you went through them like I did, that I noted were in accordance with the Office of Floodplain Management guidance from the state. So from the Florida Department of Emergency Management. So that is to say, it pretty much is all in compliance, right, with what the model floodplain ordinance is and from all of the OFM guidance. So moving on from there, wanted to talk about items that we can do to change our ordinance. PowerPoint that you were also sent. Some of these are very simple modifications. I think the way that I would like to do this today is we'll talk about each of these points. And then if you want to make a motion, if you want to accept that. And then what has to happen is that the language itself has to be approved by FDEM, so the Department of Emergency Management. So we as the county would work with the state to come up with the language for what we would propose to the Planning Council, right? So to move forward with what the proposed modifications could be, there's some cleanup and formatting errors. Very simple things throughout the document, just about 3 or 4 of them. And there was a statute reference that was incorrect. They did a 0 instead of 1. So I think that's a very simple modification that we can make. Ensuring definitions are compliant with the 4 different modifications we've done to this ordinance since 2011. Definitions have moved back and forth between our main definitions in Chapter 72 and the specific definitions we have within Division 7 flood hazard management. What I want to do is I want to compare those, because I didn't get into that nitty gritty yet, to make sure that all of those are in compliance, and that since we were moving and shifting back and forth, that we have all the correct ones within Division 7. So relatively simple thing to do, just going through line by line, making sure that everything is copacetic. Another update would be to the market value definition. The Florida Department of Emergency Management, Office of Floodplain Management guidance, they send out these guidance manuals for us to look at. The revision there would result in less judgment and less opportunity for bias. And it removes the traditional sales type appraisal that relies on recent sales of comparable properties. And it actually clarifies that cash value method. And I can send this around if everybody wants to take a look at it. We ran it by legal staff. There's nothing that would prohibit us from putting on the code except for all the things we have now. But yeah, I think it's a fairly simple change. It makes it more clear to the citizens on what they're supposed to do for market value. And a lot of that has to do with the determination of substantial damage and substantial improvements. So how they identify the monies that they've spent versus the market value of the property. And the last one on this page is to require hazardous materials to be stored above the base flood elevation for commercial properties. It's kind of specific, right? We can definitely have a discussion on that. This one, we would gain community rating system points for, and we talked about that a little bit last time. The community rating system is that program that the county is a part of that gets discounts for our residents that have NFIP flood insurance coverage, the National Flood Insurance Program. Right now, we are sitting at a class 5. So everyone gets 25% discount on flood insurance. This would just give us some additional credit points to add to that. So eventually, once we do a few other things, we get to a level 4, right? And then so on and so forth.
Before we go further, I think Tom and John had questions or comments.
Commercial properties also includes industrial properties.
That is what we were thinking about. And
John?
there could definitely be a discussion on that.
Alrighty, so it's your suggestion that we vote on this batch?
Yes.
Okay, then the chair will entertain motion.
I move that we move forward with these suggested edits and Scrivener's errors corrected.
Motion made by Tom Burbank to accept the potential modifications as presented by Samantha West, seconded by Jack Surratt, and discussion, Bill Lights.
So is this going to result in a code change, ordinance change? And we're not going to see that, or?
You will see it. So because this one is a little different, like Samantha described, it has to go through Florida Department of Emergency Management. The language itself would get written in that cooperation with them. But like we've done before, you would see the full ordinance language before it would be taken to PLDRC or to the county council.
Jessica Gall, followed by Sarah Lee.
I was just gonna note, I do think in terms of the definitions and whatnot, the recommended changes are in the backup that you guys gave us from the state level. So that gives us some idea of what that language might look like.
Sarah Lee, then Tyler.
Yeah, I was like, so what did I look at? Because I looked at this ordinance that you guys included, but Jessica just mentioned it. So I did have a question relative to that sample ordinance, right? That's what you're calling
Yeah,
that,
the model
sample.
Mhm.
The last part, require hazardous materials to be stored above the base flood elevation for commercial properties. In that sample ordinance, and maybe I just didn't look enough, but I was focused on the highlighted areas. And are we going to discuss the sample, or is this what we do today? Just this.
So the model ordinance that was sent was the original, how we based off of our current floodplain management ordinance, right? So what the group had asked for last time was they wanted to see what that model ordinance looked like compared to what we have now. And I had gone through to identify if there were any substantial changes between what was then and what's now. And it was the only changes that we have done was move definitions around, as we kind of talked about.
Yeah.
And then any other changes identified by the Office of Floodplain Management from FDEM. So no, to answer your question, plan was not to go through what the model
Okay.
ordinance says, because it is what ours says today.
Because the only comment I had, and for you to consider as you move forward, in the non-elevated accessory structures, there's no discussion about, like it's saying you could have a non-elevated accessory structure, right? And it's basically in the floodplain. Or it could be, provided A, B, C, D, except it seems like it should say, except you would be prohibited from storing hazardous materials within it.
So those are things that if we want to have that modification to be put in there, right?
Yeah.
Right now we have it, we've proposed just to do it for commercial properties and not for everyone. I think that would be a compliance issue if we said that every single person within unincorporated Volusia had to have hazardous materials outside the floodplain. We definitely can do that and make it across the board. We thought that this would be easier for a compliance just to have it as commercial, but that would be the proposal.
Yeah, because the alternative could be that all hazardous materials have to be stored outside the floodplain, which would mean you're not going to have gas for your lawnmower in your garage potentially, or whatever. And that is an option. We felt like that for commercial, non-residential uses, it seems like really reasonable. You all could debate if you think it's reasonable to put in a requirement for all properties, including residential.
Hello.
So I just wanted to talk about item 4 on the list there. Do we know how many businesses right now would become non-compliant and require improvements in order to meet the rule? I mean, and that's maybe one of the questions that I would want to understand is there's a lot of businesses that when they built, they weren't in a floodplain. They're now in a floodplain. And now if we create a cost for them to have to improve their facility, is there a grandfathering clause or, time period for them to become compliant? There's a lot of intricacies in that I see as necessary to feel comfortable moving forward with support myself. I mean, right now I'm kind of a no vote on it just as a blanket because I don't have information.
I mean, I think we could get data on the number of businesses in the floodplain. What we aren't going to know is who's got gasoline in their, whatever. We do regulate businesses that generate small quantities of hazardous waste. And we visit those businesses and we make sure that they have containment and those sorts of things. So we could come up with a number of those small quantity businesses that are mapped in the floodplain, in the 100-year floodplain.
We should be able
maybe
to
not
use
get you all the way.
tanks. Unless it's an underground tank. I don't see, other than actual filling stations, I don't see a lot of people that are going to have large underground tanks. I can put my gas can on a shelf in my garage if that's allowed.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot of that I'm not concerned about. I'm thinking about every car rental place has hazardous chemicals on site because of the car wash and other things that you're dealing with. There's a lot of these different little small business facilities that exist around. And so we're going to have a lot of implication on them. The larger businesses are going to have compliance programs, and they probably are going to be already looking at this for their own insurance discounts of having a hazardous material management plan. So I don't necessarily think that it's going to have big impacts. I just think we should be careful.
Bill, Tom, Jessica, Donna, Melissa.
And then would this apply retroactively to people who have already built in the floodplain and that's just the way it was? Or is this going to be for new development where they can fill in the floodplain and then they'll be out of it so they can store their materials out of floodplain?
I think that depends on how you would like the language to be crafted. Right now, it states that any type of storage of hazardous materials. So it would be anyone storing anything right now, right? But if you wanted to craft language that anybody after the inaction of blah, 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 right? Then we can put language in for such a thing. That would still compliance wise, you'd have to figure out everyone who's been approved by so-and-so date and things of that sort. So thinking the big picture on how it would be enforced.
Jessica, Donna.
Is it possible, right? Because now I'm thinking along, Tyler's poisoned me, he hasn't poisoned me, but it made me think. If we're talking about a gas station, right? We said gasoline is hazardous. Those are buried. Is there a way to regulate this? And would it get us the points, right? Because you said this is all about kind of the rating system. If we regulated it by saying that any hazardous waste generator permitted by the county, so whether small or large, has to store everything above base flood to narrow it to those generators.
That, or you could talk about, places like gas stations or businesses where they rely on hazardous materials as part of their business, have to have secondary containment and those sorts of things. So, that's the other thing you could say is that, blanket, you can't store hazardous materials in the floodplain unless you have, these measures to prevent that contamination from leaving the immediate site or something like that.
Done.
I think we've touched on my fundamental question. Tyler started it, and there have been other related comments. I always go to enforcement. There are the usual suspects. We have gas stations and dry cleaners, and the ones we know have hazardous chemicals. But once you get past the larger businesses, how is something like this enforced on a micro level as opposed to the macro approach?
Well, I'll tell you right now what we do for businesses that generate small quantities of hazardous waste. So businesses that generate large quantities are regulated by the DEP and they're inspected by the DEP. So gas stations and, beyond a certain amount of hazardous waste, the DEP handles that. So the county right now does the inspection and enforcement for businesses that generate small quantities. So that's like nail salons and, mom and pop shops. And the way we identify those businesses used to be through the business tax receipt program, but the council eliminated the business tax receipt. So now we identify them based on the type of business, right? So if you're a nail salon, for instance, we'll contact that business, visit the business, see if they actually generate any amount of hazardous waste. And then they get into our database and we inspect them at least every 5 years, make sure we teach them how to maintain that waste and dispose of it properly. So we just basically use the business categories to identify those businesses, and then we do those inspections. So I guess it would be, it could be tied in with the small quantity generator, SQG is what we call it, the SQG program, where that could be one other element of the inspection is whether or not you're in the floodplain. What we wouldn't likely do is expand the SQG program to inspect every business in a floodplain. We wouldn't have the staff or any revenue to support that.
So the express, so people are concerned about gas stations and similar businesses that we know have hazardous materials by definition of what they do. These already are required to have secondary containment, you said?
It depends on where they are. And so if they're in a wellhead protection zone, for instance, they have to have extra containment. It would be similar, I think, to what you'd be looking at here.
So a question, sorry to jump in about gas stations. Because I have a lovely one on the corner of my street, right in front of the ocean. And there are lovely ones right across in the river in an even worse flood zone than, being right on the coast. With rising waters, you hear about septic systems popping up out of the ground. Is that a concern with gas tanks?
No.
I mean, it's certainly a possibility if groundwater elevation comes up, but I don't know that it's the biggest concern. I think that the reason to talk about the hazardous materials stored under the base flood elevation is, the flood comes, all of the fuel that you have in your garage, if you're talking about residential, or the pesticides you keep when you spray your lawn
Into the water.
It's all in the water, right? So, in some ways, some of the larger commercial businesses like gas stations and that are much more regulated, right? They have containment already. Not that it's foolproof. And a big storm comes, all bets are off. Or over, 50 years of groundwater elevation rises significantly, that's a whole different issue. I think this is more about when the surface water comes through and washes.
So the companion question to that, and getting back to Tyler's concern, is for a small business that has a small amount of hazardous waste, could they simply elevate within their structure?
Yes. Yeah, that would be the thing. And that's what we look at now with the SPG program is how are you storing those materials? Is it elevated off the ground? Like lots of things that we already do for those businesses that we already inspect. This would just apply to more places, I think.
Thank you. And Tom?
Thank you. These small businesses still require to have fire inspections. Could this be tied in with that somehow? No business tax receipts, but they do still require fire inspections for most of these businesses.
I don't know the answer.
That's just throwing an idea out there.
And I do wanted to say about the underground tanks, we talked about on our last meeting, we have a section within Division 7 that specifically speaks to the regulations for underground tanks, making sure they're anchored to prevent flotation, collapse, lateral movement resulting from hydrodynamic and hydrostatic loads. So we do have regulations in place already for underground tanks depending on whatever is in those tanks, right? But there are regulations for that.
Madam Chair, this is Paulo Soria. So when you're discussing underground storage tanks, specifically petroleum, I wouldn't get too worried about that. The petroleum industry has protected itself with a lot of preemptions. So, and these are kind of old preemptions dating from the 80s. So 376, 317 is the main preemption on regulations of underground petroleum storage tanks. Basically, you have to go through a few steps. You have to get clearance from the Department of Environmental Protection. If it's even that department, it's another. This bill is law is kind of old, from like the 80s or 90s, and they have largely preempted this type of activity for gas stations and underground storage tanks.
Thank you. So, Tom, did you have an additional question or comment? Okay, so we had a motion to accept these potential modifications. We had a speaker say he was leaning toward a no on this. Do we want to vote, or would we like to modify the motion in some way? Okay, then. Jessica.
I was going to see if there was any appetite to amend it for a clear vote on 1 through 3, and then see if there are suggestions on 4.
I believe the motion was made by Tom Burbank. Would you like to amend it for a clean vote on 1 through 3, and then a little more discussion on 4?
Flexible.
Pardon?
I say I'm flexible. If it makes Jessica happy, I'm with it, but.
Okay. And would Jack like to re-second?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. All those in favor of accepting potential modifications 1 through 3? All those in favor? Any opposed? Thank you. Motion carries. Now, would someone like to make a motion regarding number 4 after we've discussed this for a while?
Excellent question. So you mentioned that we get CRS points for implementing this. How much flexibility do we have in that language to still get the CRS points?
So you definitely have flexibility, right? They prorate points if it's not exactly of what they're requesting. I have some. So I'll list them all out. Right now, it's 50 points for regulations that prohibit outdoor storage of materials within the regulatory floodplain. So that's straight across the board. 20 points for regulations that prohibit storage of hazardous materials anywhere in the floodplain. I think, yeah. Okay, so one's outdoor storage and the other one is storage anywhere. And then the other one is regulations that require materials to be stored indoors above the base flood elevation. So what we have given you today is already a modification of these.
So
Yeah, it would definitely be less than 50 points, depending on where we're going, right?
the concern I actually have is agriculture. As I've started sitting here and thinking about what are hazardous materials, fertilizer storage, and I don't know if like waste products from livestock becomes a hazardous material at some point due to ammonia generation. Like there's a lot of these things that I don't want to put people out of business. So I think this is a good idea. I actually think it's a good idea for everybody to be required to store their, you know, I see more residences responsible for the types of issues that we have than businesses usually. So in my mind, this is a good idea. I just want to make sure that we have a grandfather provision or some type of way, you know, personally, that's where my concern is, so that we're not putting a farmer out of business, we're not putting small business owners into a hardship and ultimately hurting our community more than we're helping it. If a farmer goes out of business, they're going to sell their land. And then we're going to have a development, which is kind of contrary to ultimately what our goals are, I think. So that's it.
Jessica?
I think to build on that, in terms of environmental review, there is language that exists, I think at the state level, because it's somewhere in my brain, about agricultural products and fertilizer that's kept and used in the ordinary course of business by a consumer. So that would be the fertilizer in the garage for the yard or for the farm. And so I've heard kind of two carve outs, which would be that one, consumer and agricultural products used in the ordinary course and according to the instructions and best management practices. And the second is uses that have a secondary containment system or protective measures that are regulated. So if we could maybe review a motion to recommend language is reviewed. That's a motion somewhere. I don't know if I want to restate it. But I can.
I believe Jessica Gao made a motion, moved that we have a couple of caveats in item 4. One would be for small businesses and agriculture, and that we would be relying on best management practices and the recommendations for containment that already exist in the environmental reviews that exist. And the other caveat or carve out, as she said, was for gas stations and other kinds of businesses that already have a secondary containment method. Yes.
I second that.
Okay, but can I make that a little more clear? So were you talking about exempting certain businesses or exempting anybody who had, say, secondary containment or another protection? Like it's,
I would say anyone who uses
okay, so not a
accepted
okay.
secondary containment system.
And then you had said consumer and ag products, and yes, Melissa, you recapped as small businesses and agriculture. Sorry. I just want to.
If it's only applying to commercial properties, I think it would be business consumers, but it's people who are using fertilizer.
Would we potentially then say, not say just commercial properties, just anyone, but consumer and agricultural products, like you said, used in the normal course would be exempt. Then it could be home everybody. Would be, well, an option would be to make it everybody, residential included, but these consumer and ag products that are used appropriately according to normal practices wouldn't be subject to it, right? I don't know.
Oh, well, I'm not sure how that would work, you know, because residential may use fertilizer. Would that be included as an agricultural use?
Or consumer, that would be
Consumer or ag products. So that's
the only thing I would say on including it for everyone instead of just non-residential is like the gas tanks. We don't really have instructions when you go fill up a little tank of gas for your garage. So I would maybe keep it at commercial.
So is that the motion you made was commercial?
It is now amended. Yeah.
So it's what I said.
Yeah. Well, yes.
No, maybe I didn't know what I said. And Jack seconded what I said. But Wendy.
So I think Tyler in his list of possible concerns also said ag waste. So do we have any animal, do we have any livestock waste lagoons in the county? And are they regulated as hazardous waste? I mean, how does DEP handle those? Certainly, we don't want lagoons flushing out in a big storm.
We don't have, livestock feedlots in Volusia County where we have concentrate, like at a farm. We don't have that. There are a couple of dairies, but they don't have those concentrated waste storage.
Okay, for the unintended consequences that we have not even thought of, that I'm sure exist out there in some commercial business somewhere, can we add in a provision that would say that, you know, when the unintended consequences identified, which I can't think of at the moment, but I'm sure they're there, that there would be a certain time frame for them to come into compliance. You know, that there would be a grace period of X, because I would think that should an unintended consequence become identified, that it is going to be costly to have some kind of secondary containment, et cetera. That, you know, these containment systems and these things are not cheap. And that could be cost prohibitive for some businesses, depending on the size of the business. And that needs to be taken into consideration. Jessica? Sure.
So I would think that this would only apply to developments moving forward, that we're not retroactively telling people to take it out of the.
No, well, if we made the change, it would say you cannot store hazardous materials in the floodplain except in these certain circumstances. That means everybody, you know, whatever properties this applies to, now you can't do it.
Well, they become non-conforming, right? Because they could do it when they.
Or they could make modifications, right?
Right.
And to Melissa's point, you know, it would follow our normal code enforcement process, which is, hey, we've become aware that you're, you know, not meeting this code. Here are ways you can come into compliance, folks that work with us to come into compliance. We work with people over and over and over and over. It's when people say, I don't care what your rules say, I'm not going to comply, that then may end up in our code enforcement process. So there is that grace period for people who have to now come into compliance with something. And just, you know, in the vein of full disclosure, these would be complaint driven, right? It would be like somebody calls us to say, hey, my neighbor is, you know, now a business and they have a paint booth and they're storing the paint in the yard, right? That's how we would find people who are not in compliance. Other than the businesses we inspect through our SQG program, it wouldn't be like we're out there knocking on people's doors to see where they're storing their gas. Yeah.
Michelle?
I think there's ways to appeals within the ordinance anyways. So I think it's not the third issues where circumstances they can appeal. That's written in the ordinance now. Yes.
And so I do just want to clarify. My motion, and I'll amend it if I need to, would be to clarify that it would be effective upon adoption and not retroactive.
So if I start a new business,
you'd have to
build a new business.
Or change or expand or, yeah, any changes to an existing, or it's damaged to 50% or more. All that.
I mean, we'll propose anything you guys vote on. I just, it's a little strange to me to say, you know, this guy can have hazardous waste in the floodplain, right? Yeah, but it's bad, and we don't think people should have hazardous waste in the floodplain because of the hazards that it poses. But you can't because you did last week, I guess. But if that,
but it wasn't illegal when they did it. That's the. I understand the policy. I just think that from a vested rights issue,
yeah,
it's gonna have to be done.
So I'm thinking dumb stuff too, like Ace Hardware. I'm a big Ace Hardware fan. So make sure those, they're herbicides that I'm not a fan of. And the pesticides are stored on upper shelves.
Right, outside the floodplain. And I think a lot of places like that, unless they were built a really long time ago, if you've built an Ace Hardware anytime in the last 10 or 15 years, you built that store above the floodplain because the rules already say your finished floor elevation have to be above the floodplain, right? So unless you've got these businesses that were built ages and ages ago, or you're in an area where it didn't used to be the floodplain and now it's mapped as floodplain, I mean, most of those places are probably already compliant. And then if you're not, then the resolution is you put them on the second shelf instead of the floor, right? So.
And then, I'm sorry, I want to recognize Wendy and Sarah Lee. And then the other kinds of businesses that larger amounts of hazardous waste under other ordinances, they've been required to have the secondary containment already. Wendy, then Sarah Lee.
Just want to point out something maybe obvious. I mean, isn't it in the business's best interest to not lose product during a flood? And so, I mean, so I'm just saying, even though that they've probably been thinking, oh, we've been needing to do this because, yeah, like last time we lost, $500,000 worth of product in the flood. Like now the county's kind of going, hey, we're going to ask you to do this now. And it just gives them the nudge that they need to do something that's in their own best interest anyway, right?
Sarah Lee, then Jack. Then Tyler.
Yeah, I'm starting to get confused. Because if we're talking about moving forward with only new, I have a very hard time saying it's okay if these hazardous materials are not stored outside base flood, but it's not okay, like hazardous materials, like they're a problem in the floodplain. If we're talking about moving forward with new, and I understand the enforcement issue, but I don't understand why, from an aspirational standpoint, we wouldn't be just saying it's got to be outside. And my comment is not limited to commercial.
Well, and to your point, I think if you're building a new business, like constructing a new business, you're constructing it outside of the floodplain.
I don't
So
know.
that would only be like if you were changing a business.
Just let's talk through the common sense of how this would actually be implemented. For existing uses, as Ginger said, unless we had a complaint, because we as a local government in the state of Florida cannot be proactive with code enforcement per Florida Statute 162. State of Florida has said that all code enforcement action has to be from a complaint and we have to have the name and the address. So we're going to be completely reactive to complaints that may occur. And I cannot for the life of me remember in my career someone calling to complain about hazardous materials in the floodplain. Now, hazardous materials, yes. So that could be something that could be activated from that perspective in regards to what's going on. In regards to existing sites, inside the building, there may be a situation that you're correct. We're going to be above the floodplain. If it's out in the parking lot, as most Ace Hardwares are, and other locations, we're not going to be able to guarantee it. And it's only going to be an issue if we get a complaint about it. And I think that if we are able to proceed forward with this as a generalized requirement, let staff do some review on how other communities have implemented said standard so that way, specifically with existing uses, then that way we can find out what are the best practices for local government to enforce this. Obviously, anything coming in. So if we got a new tractor supply company, or if you got a new Lowe's or body paint type place, that would obviously be one of the comments that our folks in land development would be reviewing and making comments. They identified any outside storage areas for those materials.
She's in the bathroom. She may be back before we vote. My concern is when we say hazardous materials, the big ones are obvious and make sense. Gas, scary things. A dry cleaning solvent is hazardous.
Mhm.
A firefighting foam is hazardous. So all of those structures that could be those older retail facilities who may have storage of these items below that could have astronomical costs to bring a dry cleaning facility above base flood if it's not already.
No, the whole facility doesn't have to come up, just the hazardous materials themselves have to come up. So where you're storing those solvents has to be on the second shelf instead of on the floor. And we are actually doing that now with our SQG program. We go to all the dry cleaners and those folks and teach them how to store their materials. So I don't think it's as big a deal for those as you're thinking. Now, yeah, if you had to lift your whole business above the floodplain, that's a whole different animal. No, this is just the material itself should be outside the floodplain.
And would this change, if adopted, would it still allow and I know it's not used, but it's in the code, the waiver of floodplain regulations in a specific instance like that, where there's the floodplain administrator has the authority to modify?
Yeah, everything in the code, everything in that section has that waiver provision.
Okay, so we had a motion, now I'm acting chair. I don't know if we need a new motion or not. Yep, Tyler. And then Jack, and then Wendy.
So I kind of agree with the idea that we don't just take somebody and make them non-compliant that is existing. That's been my concern the whole time, is how to address that. That means that there's going to be situations that need to be addressed, but I'm thinking dry cleaners, I'm thinking marinas, I'm thinking places that you have equipment and other stuff that you're not reasonably scrubbing of hazardous material that is going to be nearly impossible to have and operate without rebuilding your facility above the floodplain. We have to have some path for them to have either a time period to come into compliance to move. And, one of the other things that I'm thinking about in my head is we have like the Elevate Pollution Program or Elevate 386 program. There's grants and other things that could be available to assist with this existing in place things today. So this isn't even necessarily something that we have to pass on, but I'm uncomfortable suggesting that we send something through the process into council that could create non-compliance at a level that we just don't know what it is. And I don't know how I'm not trying to create an exercise for staff, so I'm in my head trying to figure out, and I'm thinking out loud here, how do we find out what the scale of this concern is? Because if it's complaint driven and I have an Ace Hardware store down the street from me and I own Super Discount or True Value or whatever else, maybe I want to turn in a complaint on the Ace Hardware if I'm compliant and hurt their business and whatever else. I don't like the idea of creating an enforcement gap scenario on who wins and loses as our solution either. Although that oftentimes is how we deal with these types of conflicts. So I like the idea that we move forward with everything new today and that maybe we get a little more information to come back and look at everything existing.
I hear you, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But I'm not sure how they give us that information, how that information is kind of received and dealt with, because I think that there are too many businesses. I'm thinking of things like printers, ink, things of that nature. Tough situation, because they may very well have solvents that are on the floor level and too hard to move. But at the same time, I think it's important that we make the move at some moment. Maybe not, maybe now is not the time, and I'm not sure what the investigation would be on the staff's part to try to figure this out. But one way to go about it is to say, okay, it's for all businesses, this thing is going on, but an existing business has a period of time to become compliant. And that period of time could be pretty long. It could be 6 months or something of that nature. At that time, they could complain that in fact it was burdensome, or they could seek a grant, or they could do these other things. But at least we'd be moving forward, because the motion that I second, I was really thinking of all current businesses, not going forward, just new businesses. So, I think there's something in between. And my question, I guess, would go to you, Ginger. If you felt like more information would work, okay, about the unintended consequences or the nature of the businesses, or something like that. If more information made a difference, then I'm prepared to wait and to second, in fact, the new thing. But otherwise, I would just be for trying to amend this proposal and say that there's a long period for implementation.
I don't know who is first, Bill or Samantha.
I wanted to comment on, we have the Program for Public Information, which is the outreach component of the CRS program that we have. So it's a multi-jurisdictional document about outreach that all the CRS communities are a part of and develop their outreach plan for the next 5 years, which can be amended, throughout the time frame. But this could be something that is added to that document to make sure that we have a large outreach effort to the commercial businesses, new or existing, right? However you go with that. And to make them, not make them, but educate them on what they need to do for that, right? So it won't result in a compliance issue. Maybe whenever this would potentially be enacted, we start doing the outreach then or beforehand or when it's going through the process. So that's definitely something that we can do and work with emergency management on.
Bill.
This question's for the engineers in the room. Don't we have floodplain maps, but then some are not, don't have the elevation assigned, and then some do have the elevation assigned? So how do we deal with the ones that are in the floodplain that there's no base flood elevation assigned?
Yes.
Somebody has to hire an engineer. And the short answer, and so this is what I'm talking about, potential unintended consequences. I don't know how many businesses have hazardous materials storage. I mean, fertilizer or gasoline in a 5-gallon can is different from a 500-gallon tank of gasoline or diesel. I don't know how many businesses have a significant storage system that doesn't have secondary containment that would be impacted. If it's 3, I'm countywide, that's not something that I'm super concerned about us getting wrapped around the axle on. I don't need to be poisoning the conversation in that way. But if it's 500, then that could be a whole different ballgame of how many people are having to perform a flood study and everything else so that they can prove they've met this burden. And the way that I heard what Samantha read of the CRS language was outdoor storage in the floodplain. So I'm thinking in my head, if I have a tank on a trailer that's 3 feet off the ground and the floodplain is to a foot above ground, am I compliant or not by that rule? I can interpret it both ways in my head because it's technically in the floodplain. It's parked in the floodplain and I can't get to it without going through floodwaters to deal with it. What happens if a log floats into it or something else? What happens if it gets toppled over due to the ground becoming saturated and collapsing? And so if that interpretation changes in the future, it could also impact us. I'm having a lot of challenge that I don't understand the implications of this myself, but I do see a lot of costs.
Wendy, then Tom, and then Jessica.
I think this is a really good discussion and we don't have a motion on the table, but I would like to recommend that we push forward past this item. And I mean, tabling it is not the appropriate term because there's no motion. There is a motion for the fourth item. Okay, sorry. I propose then that we table this item and move on to all of the other very important things we need to get to supposedly by the end of our meeting today, so we can do wetlands next time.
I can withdraw my motion with the request that perhaps I'm thinking to the comment that was made, Port Orange for all of their nonconformities has an amortization schedule of that you're allowed to remain until this date and then you have to be in compliance. And it's like structured. If we can look at a potential review of that as well when this item comes back.
So to recap, the motion for number 4 has been withdrawn by its proposer, Jessica Gao, and she has made the suggestion that we look at Port Orange's amortization schedule when we revisit item 4. Next.
Okay,
Madam Chair,
now next,
What, John?
Yeah, may I jump in and add just one other comment?
Yes.
Okay, as far as agriculture is concerned, there are two different storage activities that go on. One that, at least that comes to my mind, one is your pesticide storage area. And your pesticide storage area is inspected by Florida Department of Agriculture Consumer Services. There's nothing actually in there that designates it as floodplain, or it doesn't address floodplains, but there are requirements for, securing your pesticides, having a floor that contains any spilled like that. And the same for fuel tanks for some of these diesel pumps that they use, and also for their fertilizer, their potential liquid fertilizer. You have to have, I think, like 140% or 150% the actual tankage for containment built around those. So there are some secure systems in place. I know that. But I don't have my fingers on the specific handbooks or whatever that require that. And Ginger, you may want to just look at some of those. It would be under the Florida Department of Agriculture Consumer Services.
Thank you, John. Before we go on to the next 2 points of potential modifications, it's the 2:30 moment. Should we take a brief break and come back in 8 minutes?
Yeah. Oh, thanks. Yes. Oh.
And just feel like we need to grab some. Yeah.
Yeah. So send it out after this meeting. Thanks. We'll talk about it.
On basis, not easy.
Yeah.
You can't do a sample.
Well, yeah. If we bring that, bring that test. Yes. Thank you.
What are you drinking? What was that? Energy drink, buddy? Okay, I have to tell you, just showing where my mind went out. The wording, the lettering on it, like, I know it's the,
That's like a small. Enjoying it. That's right. Oh, yeah. Everything. Thank you. Yes, sir. So the copy that I did for you. We're Boston, it's Boston. It's brainless. Hey, again, next week, guys. Again, next week. I'm just happy we got. That's participation in China. This year, Christmas year. That's fine. You don't have to keep up with it. Stop the history. It's harsh. Yes. It's only about that. So we have some deserts.
That's not in line. Yes. You want me
Yeah.
And, you know. Yes, I think it's a good idea. But we can talk about mechanics. Yeah. So I went first, like, oh, see, that was me. Yes. Yes.
Thank you, everybody. Calling the meeting back to order, please and thank you. For the record, Member Burbank has left the meeting. We still have quorum. And we are ready to take up, to continue with potential modifications to Division 7 flood hazard management.
Okay, so for these two items on this slide, I'm going to take them one at a time. So first, we want to talk about adding avoidance minimization criteria to this Division 7. Essentially, it would be almost the same type of verbiage from the wetland ordinance for avoidance and minimization. The two key aspects would be avoiding the impact altogether by not taking a certain action or parts of an action, right? And then 2, minimizing impacts by limiting the degree or magnitude of the action or implementation. So avoid it or minimize it. And that would be one section within this division. I want to talk about that one and make a motion, and then we move on to the next one, which might have.
Just to go.
Silly question, but this would not apply to areas where there would be a map amendment to remove it from the floodplain.
That is correct.
The lights.
This applies to all residential also?
The way that it's worded right now would be, yes, it'd be across the board.
And so thinking about that, right, like operationalizing that. So if somebody comes in and they're building, say, a house and on a vested lot in the floodplain, and they come in with a proposal to build slab on grade. Avoidance or minimization would be, okay, I have the right to build my house here, but I'm going to use stone wall construction, or I'm going to use pier construction, right? That's minimizing your impact in the floodplain. And maybe you still have to have fill because you have a septic tank. That's not avoidable, right? Much like we do with the wetland ordinance. If it's something that you can't avoid, then you can't avoid it. And then you get to, you know, do you have compensating storage and all those things, depending on the type of development, but it really just puts in there sort of the way to think about it. Then the way to think about it is to have as little impact in the floodplain as possible by using this sort of stepwise approach.
Thank you. Wendy?
Is it appropriate time now to make a motion to approve this? Okay, I'm making a motion to approve this.
Wendy Anderson, seconded by Sarah Lee Morrissey. I think do I do discussion now? Yes, discussion, title number.
So what do we have today for avoidance and minimization? Because anytime that we deal with the development, we're typically looking at if we are modifying the floodplain by filling in it, we're looking at cup for cup of some kind of mitigation. So is this really just single family homes?
This is for any type of development, and we'll talk about compensating storage, I think, on the next slide. But this is avoiding and just minimizing your impact, just site planning, right? So if you do not have to have a lot in the floodplain, you could modify it over here, do a cluster subdivision, that type of thing, how you can do a minimization of impact.
So this would be taking away our ability to do modifications and map amendments with the modification?
No, because that is taking it out of the floodplain completely, and it wouldn't be on the floodplain map. And so this entire majority of this division would not apply to development anymore because it would not be in the floodplain.
But right now, there's no restrictions. You have a floodplain, you can impact it if you want, if you compensate for it. And there's no design alternatives or anything. If you can compensate for it, you can do it, right?
And well, first and foremost, if you read through our comprehensive plan and in our floodplain management, the number one thing is avoidance of the floodplain. So what you will hear coming out of staff through the pre-application and throughout the application process is please move as much as you can out of the floodplain. You as design professionals also are aware that the cost of doing work in the floodplain is much more costlier to your client. So what we're trying to do is come to that mutual understanding. Where's the best place to do this with the minimal amount of impacts? Unfortunately, sometimes you have to have wording that is a little bit more blunt and direct for folks who are not necessarily looking for that mutual benefit. And that's what this wording is guided towards. So if there are options and people are just saying, no, I don't want to, I can cite a real world example where someone was hell bent that that was where they were going to place their home. They didn't care about flooding or not. They wanted to do so. They did not try to avoid. They did not try to minimize. This would give us that availability to work with them to come up with a better solution so we would not be facing filling the floodplain. And with single family lots, many times it's very difficult, we realize, to do compensatory storage as well.
Tyler, I think to your question, in reality, it's most likely to apply to vested lots, whether they be residential or commercial. Because if you're doing, say, a new subdivision, you'd already be hearing from us, we really don't want you to put new lots in the floodplain, but that's the time when you would do map revisions so that those lots wouldn't be in a floodplain, right? So I think in a new development, this would probably be less of an issue because you could do a map amendment. That makes sense? It's really on lots of record where we would say, we really want you to go through these steps, try to avoid, try to minimize, and then you get to the mitigate section.
I thought that we already had avoidance and minimization standards. I mean, that's kind of how play started. It was we encouraged from day one in the meeting.
Yeah, we just don't have the language. And so this gives us, as the staff, the ability to say, hey, the code says you should avoid and minimize. Tell us what you've done to do that. Whereas now, that's not in the language. And so we like to ask that of folks, but we don't have the code to back up that statement. It's in the comp plan, but putting it in the actual land development regulations helps during the review.
I mean, effectively, we already have mitigation as an option. That's not being taken away. So it's avoid, minimize, or mitigate is the standard that would be rolled into. So it's not saying if you have land in the floodplain, suddenly we're going to be restricting your ability to use it. We're saying that if you use that, you need to make modifications so that its use is no longer in floodplain. That doesn't seem problematic to me. I was confused. Thank you.
I do want to jump in real quick. John said he couldn't hear us. John, can you hear us now? Aubrey, Paolo, can anyone hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
We can hear and know.
John needs to unmute to answer.
Continue discussion.
Jessica, then Bill.
Two questions. When you're doing a map amendment, is there any concern or do we need to have wording about, so say a project comes in for site plan review? It is going to concurrently go through a map amendment. And it's not going to be finalized until you bring in the fill and you can show that it's done. Is there a conflict between the site plan approval to then bring in fill to do the map amendment and how it is noted that this will be removed from the floodplain for your review?
I think maybe just adding the mitigation option is available, but it requires the process of getting everything done before CO issue.
And when we say the word mitigation, we really mean floodplain compensation, right? Just that word mitigation is thrown around a lot, and even the county council is like, mitigation for what? So,
Yeah, so I'm gonna use an example that if I fill on the bank of the intercoastal and floodplain, I am not substantially creating any type of adverse impact to my neighbors if I'm near an inlet. If I'm down in Mosquito Lagoon, or if I'm really far from an inlet, I can start to have an impact. So there's conditions that the fill would be de minimis and not require compensating storage. There's cases where you have contained floodplains that are simply because they don't have an outfall. You could provide an outfall or other mechanism to prevent changes. So there's a lot of engineered solutions that can be mitigation beyond just cut compensation that are allowed under all of the FEMA and floodplain management guidance. We don't see them used as frequently because they come with complexity in proving their valid.
Do we need to see if Wendy wants to modify her for motion at all, given some of the language, or can we go ahead and vote on it as is and you've made notes? Because you're gonna bring it back to us, right?
The specific language would be brought back to you, yes.
So we can vote. Okay. All those in favor? Any opposed? Motion carries. Thank you.
Okay, so the next one, the floodplain study for closed basins, I want Tad to speak to that item. Thank you, Tad.
Sure. It's my pleasure. In this case, where'd everything go? All right. Floodplain studies for closed basins, as we've mentioned in previous meetings, when FEMA was establishing flood maps, they were looking at things that were directly connected ultimately to the ocean or had flow to the ocean. We have several different closed basins, particularly on the west side in the DeLand Ridge area, all the way up and down the ridge from DeBerry north to DeLand. And in those areas, they did not actually establish a floodplain elevation because it didn't meet their criteria for the definition. That said, we do know that obviously during large rain events, water puddles up in those closed basins and does create similar concept to a floodplain in which that, when a storm occurs, we're getting large areas that are inundated with water. And it makes sense in those areas, if you're a part of a closed basin, to go ahead and have that study and identified. And particularly if you're at the bottom of the basin, making sure that you've created the volume offset so that flooding is not being pushed up onto adjacent properties and impacting any of your neighbors. So preparing a quick study associated with closed basins. It's generally not that complicated. Most closed basins are actually pretty small. If you do run into a larger one, then it may take a little bit more study, but for the most part, most of that is a lot less than establishing a floodplain elevation in the zone A, for example, where it's not currently established by FEMA. Those can be rather complicated and have a lot of connecting sections. For a closed basin, it really shouldn't be that complicated. So.
Overall number, what are we talking?
In terms of closed basins on the west side of the county, oh geez, I mean, you're probably talking in the high hundreds would be my guess. There are a lot of them that are very small. Usually the definition for a closed basin is if you have a 100-year or a 25, 96-year storm. Again, both of them are basically equivalent. If that water does not leave that depressional area or that low area, then that's a closed basin. So we see that, like I said, in the DeLand Ridge all over the place.
So are we saying that the county's gonna do these studies or each individual person as they
No,
come in?
each development, when they go in, and they would be responsible for that aspect of it. Obviously, if it's a part of an area that the county is studying as one of its basin studies, then that information will be provided. But no, if somebody is developing in a closed basin, it would be their responsibility for providing that information, much the same way that if they were developing in an open basin that had zone A, as Tyler said, hire an engineer, figure it the hell out. Same problem, but generally on a smaller scale for the most part.
Any other questions for Ted? Sterling.
So theoretically, like, what's the biggest potential, like if somebody had to do a basin study, a floodplain study in a closed basin, like, I'm just trying to think of,
Sure, trying to put a scale to it.
yeah.
On the west side, Lake Gertie is probably the biggest closed basin I can think of. So that's a pretty
That's a
large
very
basin.
big, I mean, I'm familiar with that, so I can picture it. So
That would be the high end, and then you'd have, basins, closed basins on the 3 to 5 acre scale would be rather common. I'd be willing to bet that a majority of them are closer to that by a lot.
So that does have the potential of being an onerous request.
No, for the most part, I don't know that it is, because again, what you're studying is the amount of area, and you know what the runoff is going to be. And you just have to identify a rough approximation of what the impervious percentage is. It ultimately should not be that complicated. And now you can make it more complicated if somebody wants to get in and really study how the sub-basins work and those areas. You know,
Okay.
my argument would be that, look, it all ends up at the bottom. So I would keep it as simple as possible. And
So what kind of language would we be anticipating? There's got to be, like, you can't leave it as a floodplain study, like, would we be expecting to see some language that says a floodplain study that includes?
the floodplain study, or the study, if you prefer something along those lines instead of using the word floodplain, I don't think there's a problem with using it, but would require that a basin analysis would be done utilizing a 100-year storm to develop the elevation that water stages to based on that storm within said closed basin. So they would define the closed basin. They would also take a look at the characteristics of said basin, the amount of impervious. Remember, we talked about this before. You're identifying what your curve number is. That would be the same thing they would do in an open basin, identify those areas, and then run a model that basically establishes that. Again, a large portion of that depends on the nuances that they put into it in terms of, you know, if they go out and detail each of the different individual pipe sizes and try to include all of that. My argument would be that that's not going to have that much of an effect. All the water ultimately ends up at the bottom of said basin, whether it's a short time period getting there or a long period getting there, it all still ends up there, and that's what I would hold them to. So it would really be a fairly simple calculation. It would just be identifying the area, which isn't that onerous. You're really taking a look at a contour map and establishing those limits.
And it's just analogous to if you're in a flood zone A, you have to determine what the base flood elevation is right now, right? So it's the same thing, but just protecting the people in the closed basins from building below where they should build.
It's impressive.
So then Tyler, oh, Jessica. Bill Tyler.
Devil's advocate on this, would we have to account for it? We're accounting for build out impervious surface.
Mhm.
Would these models need to account for existing stormwater systems that are within the basin?
Well, what I'm saying is I would allow the engineer to do that, but again, I'm going to make the argument that it all ends up at the bottom anyway. So, you know, impervious or pervious isn't going to have that great of an effect. It's going to change the amount of time it takes to get there. But I'm looking again at a max stage, and I'm going to assume the worst characteristics in terms of percolation, which most of the time is not counted for anyway. Basin size and the rain are going to be your two biggest factors.
Does that happen one time and somebody studies the basin and then everybody else uses that study? Or does it, every time a new development goes in that basin, they have to?
No, somebody's already done the work. It's much like, it's a similar concept to a traffic study. If somebody's already done the background and then you're just building off of that, making any modifications that are accounted for based on your particular development.
At first I was scared timing wise, but this sounds like a smaller scope. I've only seen, I think, open basin floodplain studies that take over a year to complete. That's not what we're looking at here.
No. Vast majority of these are going to be very quick, and only something like Lake Gertie could potentially be complicated, and a lot of that depends on, you know, the level at which the engineer that's performing the study wants to take it. But I'm going to still argue that it's worst case scenario, assume that all the water ends up in the bottom, and that it's not percolating going anywhere else, because even if it becomes groundwater, it's still making its way to the bottom. So.
Any additional questions, Wendy?
I do think we need to unpack the percolation component and the soils. And I'm just gonna say soils are everything. I'm gonna look at both. Soils are everything. And to just base a basin study on the topography, particularly in a closed basin, just simply doesn't make sense. And so I look at the Taylor Road study that just came out earlier in April, And they defined their basin based on elevation. They didn't even take into account most of the developments that are already built in what used to be the larger basin, but now it's a smaller basin because we've hemmed it in with developments. And so, but the real problem there is it closed in because of the topography that you see from the top down, or is it closed in because you have a confining layer beneath it? And there is no perk. There's nowhere for that water to go. Some basins are closed because of the soils. Some basins are closed because of the topography. And both of those are important. Both of those are contributing to flooding. And so to say that we're not going to talk about the subsurface movement of water is missing a lot of the things that are going on here, including in the Taylor Road study.
Yeah, don't think we said anything that was different from that. I mean, the groundwater is generally going to follow the topography. For establishing the limits on a basin like Lake Gertie, you've basically established where the groundwater is generally going to flow. It's going to go downhill. It follows gravity just the same way that it does when it's above surface. When you get into the below grade sections of it, you may have certain sections that will go ahead and hold water when they're impervious in a basin like that. But that's where I'm saying you would go ahead and be conservative and assume that there is nothing and that it's making its way ultimately to the bottom. Because what you're trying to do is identify the elevation in the worst case scenario that the water would come to at that size storm over that basin. And that's what I'm saying with regard to percolation, there really would not be expected to be a whole lot. There are certain basins, for example, a lot of closed basins, and I won't say a majority, but I say a lot, that are tied to sinkholes. And those recover very well because they have a direct connection to the aquifer. So to say that I would never consider percolation in a situation like that, you're going to have two opposite extremes based on the soils conditions. So in a sinkhole, you're going to recover very quickly, and you're not going to stage as high. In a basin like Lake Gertie, which isn't tied to a sinkhole and does have soils conditions which do hold ultimately the water up, then yeah, you're going to have a very slow percolation rate and you're going to have a much higher water table. So I just wouldn't say hard and fast that we're never going to consider groundwater conditions. We would need to see the borings and the information, and the professional engineer would make the judgment on what percolation rates we would use. But the only place I would consider the soils conditions would be at the very bottom of the closed basin where the staging of that water occurs. I would not allow them, or would not be in favor of allowing them to use areas that are uphill of that, because the water may get around. With regard to open basins and closed soils, but if you have an open basin, it by definition, the water is going to get around and go downhill. The soils will have some effect on it, but it has more of an effect on how slowly the groundwater aspects of that move and the depth at which the layer occurs versus good soils and so on and so forth has a lot of effect on that aspect of it. But that's a slightly different conversation. But
Any other questions? Would someone like to make a motion? I'm sorry, I didn't have my. That was the first one. Yeah. Okay. No, Jack.
I make a motion that that we require a floodplain study for closed basins.
Motion made by Jack Surratt that floodplain studies for closed basins be a requirement, seconded by Michelle Riddick. All of those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? One opposing vote, and I think John's not with us anymore.
You should be back on. John, are you there?
I'm on. Can you hear me?
I can hear sound, but I can't distinguish what that sound is doing. Is that a yes vote from John or a no vote?
It was a yes vote.
Thank you. Heard loud and clear then. Thank you. Motion carries.
All right. Next one. So we're going to want to take these separate as well. Next would be to add compensating storage criteria to the code, specifically, well, it all goes together. This language was taken out of, the New Smyrna Beach compensating storage language that if you were listening to council yesterday, that was brought up by Councilman Robbins. So portions that we had discussed were to require no more than 50% of the total flood storage volume of a parcel may be filled or occupied by development. And then compensating storage would be 1.5 to 1 for parcels larger than 1 acre. So it was cup for cup before, so we're saying 1.5 cups to 1.
What are those measurements based on, the 50% and the 1.5 to 1? What's the rationale for those?
That's simply a political question. There's no science behind that. They're just saying, look, if you're going to go ahead and impact the floodplain, we're going to get a pound of flesh, I guess. So, or a half a pound of flesh.
And the 1.5 to 1 does get you CRS credit points. So that is where New Smyrna could have pulled it from.
So that answer, that gives a rationale for part of that, 1.5 to 1. But the 50%, that's just. We don't have any historical data or anything that would help us with that.
New Smyrna Beach put it in place. But that's the only reason.
But that's recent, right?
And we had heard from council that they wanted us to look at what New Smyrna had done, so that's why it's here before you.
Okay.
It's a surface restriction within the floodplain. It doesn't necessarily address the actual volume of area in the floodplain. It's just saying within the floodplain, you shall not impact more than 50%. And that what you do impact, we want a safety factor of 50% over what the calculations. That's it.
Thank you. Wendy.
I make a motion to approve this, just so we can move into a formal discussion, but I also have a comment or a question about it, which I want to wait until we're in official discussion period.
Wendy has moved that we vote on this. Do we have a second?
I'll second it.
Jack Surratt seconds. So then Wendy question, Tyler question, Bill question.
So I think back to our conversation about stormwater several weeks or months ago, and we proposed a modification to our ordinance to actually position stormwater ponds more to the center of a neighborhood, rather than to the edge for safety purposes and leakage and stuff like that. So I've been thinking about compensatory storage, and again, I'm kind of looking to the engineers in the room to think through this with us. It seems like compensatory storage, where you put that matters. That putting it anywhere on site does not allow for compensation. There are certain places on site where you can compensate better than others, not just for, the displacement of the floodwaters based on, that are created by fill or, mass grading or whatever is creating the impact to the floodplain. But it isn't just that, but also the movement of floodwaters through the site. So you had floodwaters coming from offsite that used to move through the site. You have to accommodate that movement of floodwater through the site. If you put your compensating storage someplace else, like how do you not have it dam up the movement of water through the site, I guess is what I'm asking. Is compensating storage a way to address that particular problem? How and where you put it?
Yes, when a developer or property owner impacts the floodplain, the compensating storage has to be what we call hydraulically connected in the first place. So you can't just go dig a hole somewhere over here. If it's not connected to where the rest of the flooding or floodplain is occurring, then you can't do it. We also require, as a part of that, the elevations at which the impact to the floodplain occur, you are basically mimicking the volumes at those elevations. So you can't just go dig at a higher section and go 1 foot across 4 feet when the impact was from anywhere from 2 to 4 feet. So there are elements of that we require. With regard, yeah. With regard to where it occurs, we generally try to get it as close to where the impact occurs as possible. So on a smaller site, that's obviously pretty easy. On a bigger site, it gives them a little bit more room to play with. But for the most part, we're looking to make sure it's in that same basin or sub-basin in which it occurs. So, and that way the idea is that, all right, this basin is where the flood impact occurs, and this is where the mitigation occurs. Therefore, there should not be, if the volumes are similar, an impact or a change to the existing condition. With regard to the, what you were describing with that second half is more of like a floodway element of it. If you're on a river or a canal or something along those lines where that occurs, obviously we try to make sure that the mitigation for the impact does not create a situation where that flow path is impacted. We don't allow, if that's the only route through, if there's a ditch through the middle of your property and that's floodplain, we don't allow you to cut that off without recreating at best a similar situation, again, mimicking elevations and volumes as much as we reasonably can. I can't think of too many recently where somebody has done had a situation like that where they're cutting off a ditch. Usually it's a bigger canal or an area overall. But yes, we do require that flood path. You can't create an enclave, so to speak, of water that gets trapped. We don't allow that.
Are those guidances written down, or are they kind of in conversation between staff?
It's actually the language is very general. It does not get that specific, but we interpret the general along those lines. If there's a desire to go ahead and be more specific, certainly we can work towards that. What we don't want to wipe out is the general language, because that does provide a lot of leeway when we're asking for an engineer to provide that information that, hey, this doesn't generally meet the requirement. So I'd be careful about being just specific, if that makes sense.
Tyler, then Bill, then Jessica.
So briefly, I'll just answer I think the general language says that we must accommodate off-site flows to the property.
Right.
So generally speaking, if you aren't accommodating the off-site flow to your property, you're not compliant with the criteria, which is most of the cases that we see of concerns when a development is downstream of somebody and suddenly they start having flooding, that there might not have been adequate accommodation somewhere. And, that might be something that those case by cases need to be looked at more specifically rather than generically. I personally have always been required to show that I've accommodated offsite flows. And if I didn't accommodate one, I get a comment until I show how I accommodated it. So
yeah, we keep an eye on Tyler.
Yeah, especially. So I think the New Smyrna Code is specific to the New Smyrna flooding problem, which is largely not closed basin floodplains and not floodplains that are affected by flow and that are affected more by storm surge. And so when we look at that condition, which in their study, most of their impacted parcels were coastal parcels or riverfront parcels or otherwise on the saltwater water bodies. There was some in Venetian Bay. I don't want to exclude that there was other, but largely it's dealing with that. I think the county's flooding problems have partially been that, but largely they've been other types of flooding things. I don't like these rules personally. I kind of agree with the pound of flesh approach. And I don't own any property in the floodplain, so I have no skin in this game. But if you own a property in the floodplain, this is just devaluing your ability to develop it and restricting it beyond just offsetting your adverse impacts of developing it.
He pretty much said everything, and you did too, but the difference between floodway, floodplain, you don't ever develop in a floodway. But I didn't realize there was also restrictions to making sure you still have the floodplain.
Well, it's just
flow.
It's any offsite flow that comes to your property.
So the item one is two-part, right? It's not only the 1.5 cups per one, but it is also you cannot impact any more than 50% of the floodplain on your site. Concern.
Yes.
Okay, I want to make sure I understood that 50% is separate from the 1.5. My question goes back to map amendments, which is that we've said this division doesn't apply if you have a map amendment. So in my mind, I'm trying to look at the balance of smart regulation versus the approach that would be taken to look at this, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you do a map amendment after you bring in fill for development to bring it out of the floodplain is removed. We talked about that a little bit earlier. So then how do these interact?
Well, that's a great point, because in my mind,
The floodplain's not removed. The structure is out of the floodplain. So there's a big difference. The floodplain is still in existence all around it on that property and everything else. That the area is not subject to fill. What has happened is the structure is now, because of fill, outside of the flood.
If you do a map amendment after?
Well, that's the whole point behind the Lomer or letter of map revision, letter of map amendment. And the thing about it is that if you're utilizing fill to get the structure out of the floodplain, you should be doing compensatory storage so that that way the impact of bringing it out of the floodplain does not push the floodplain into other adjacent properties. Because remember, at the heart of why we're all worried about compensatory storage, floodplain's not going away. It just gets moved. And we want to move it so it does not have external impacts on other property owners or the general public.
The way I would read this is that you can't, whatever exists now, you have 100 acres, that's all in the floodplain. You can't take more than 50 acres out of the floodplain or fill in that, which means you can't map amendment your way out of it. You can't fill the whole 100 acres and say it's no longer floodplain, so it doesn't apply to me. That's the way I would implement that.
So, and that's my reading of it too, which is if you've got a property fully within the floodplain, then you have half the value that you.
And I have a question about that too. So if the objective, we're all traumatized by hearing about flooding or experiencing flooding ourselves in some cases in our county. It's a problem. And the goal is to fairly create conditions that minimize risk reasonably for ourselves and our neighbors. And so in theory, the idea of if you're bringing in fill to build your home, to take the structure out of the floodplain, but that geographic defined area is a floodplain, it makes sense to me that that displacement has to be dealt with. So in that regard, I'm on board, but I'm troubled by the 50%. And wondering if there's another way to, or if we all, do we already achieve this objective through some other means? Or from a problem solution standpoint, it makes sense, the idea behind it, the goal of it. Does this respond appropriately to it?
Yeah, and that's what the discussion is here today. But I've been thinking about it sort of like we think about wetlands, right? Which is we have statements in the code, and we, I think, have shared these feelings among this group that wetlands have value. And so while there are cases where you can fill in the wetland and you can provide mitigation for it, I think on balance, we have agreed that that's not the best solution, right? That's your last solution. And so I'm kind of thinking of the floodplain the same way. And maybe I'm certainly not trying to speak for anybody in the room, but for me, I'm thinking, okay, floodplain has intrinsic value. And fiddling with it, while you might be able to engineer your way out of it, is probably not the best. It's not your first choice, it's your last choice, right? And so when I think about it in that framework, and it gets back to the avoidance and minimization, is try not to fill in the floodplain. And this 50% thing is just a minimization standard, right? So try not to fill in the floodplain. If you can't accomplish that, then you have the mitigation, and that's the 1.5. right? So it's the same thing if you fill in a wetland, the bank credits you buy aren't one-to-one, right? Because there's an understanding that the mitigation you did wasn't as valuable as the thing you built. So sure, not everybody's thinking about it in that same way, but to me, that's how I'm thinking about it is number one is minimization. And number two is, okay, you have to mitigate it and you have to mitigate it a little bit more than you took out because it's not, it may or may not be as effective as what was there originally.
So this would be a minimum, you just said, I just want to make sure I understood what you said, that the 50% would be a minimization standard. Okay. I think it was Bill, Tyler, Jessica, or Donna, I'm sorry, Donna was after me.
So are both of those, in the New Smyrna Beach?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Yep. They actually had some additional standards in there, that made it more stringent. So we, have them for you today, Jim.
Okay, and so, so we're doubling up on our avoidance minimization. We're saying on the last slide, you have to avoid minimize, but here, there's a baseline. You cannot go more than 50%, and then you have to avoid and minimize from there.
I think as you would write the code, you would say you have to minimize your impacts. And if you agree to this, then that would be in that section, in minimization. You can't impact more than 50% of the total flood storage volume. It'd be together, right? It's not like you minimize, then you get down here and now you're minimizing more. Which was, I think, what you just said.
With regard to item 1, is development, does that include agricultural property?
The way it's written in New Smyrna, it's for everyone.
Yeah, well, I mean, New Smyrna Beach, I mean, most cities don't have agricultural lands in the first place, so they probably did not discuss, they probably don't even have ag zoning, so it would not have fallen to them to make that decision. That is the question, not necessarily as it applies to number 2 so much, but as it applies to number 1, are we basically telling agricultural property owners they can only farm half of their property? Huh? They could very easily do so. Depends on the crop you want to raise.
Yes, so the way it's written right now, it applies to everybody.
So that's
that would
something
be
that
Point of discussion.
that you might want to consider. The agricultural groups would not be too much in favor of that. Now, that said, doesn't mean we should exempt them from floodplain. It's just the way this is written, they could only use half of their property for agricultural purposes.
Donna, Tyler, Jessica.
In the grand scheme of things, this might be a random question, but subjective words always jump out at me. And number 2, the substantive improvements, I'm just curious to know if substantive is defined anywhere. Sorry, substantial.
We're not there yet. We're still on compensatories.
I had hesitated to ask, and we were kind of bouncing back and forth between 1 and 2, so I wasn't sure when to ask it. But at whatever point it's appropriate, I'm curious to know if that word is defined anywhere.
Also, the 1 and 2 are the Roman numerals under Roman numeral 1. We're trying to confuse everyone. We do this a lot. But we will get there. Tyler, Jessica.
So Donna, briefly to answer your question, 50% of the structure value is the definition of a substantial improvement to an existing structure in Florida Building Code. I'm assuming that's what we would hold as the definition here. So dealing with compensatory storage criteria, floodplain value, all of that. Floodplain is a hazard. Floodplain is a liability. Floodplain, to me, is not a valuable asset. If we can engineer solutions to eliminate floodplain, that is a positive thing, not a negative thing. I disagree completely with the sentiment that Ginger shared about there being value to floodplain. I believe that if you can cut a ditch to route the water more efficiently to the ocean or to somewhere else, and you have attenuated your flow so that you have the same travel time for that water to leave your site as you had pre-development, you haven't adversely impacted your neighbors. If you elevate your site so your stuff isn't subject to flooding, that's safer for everybody. I don't see that as a negative. I see this as discouraging that practice. it's taking tools away from engineers and saying that we're not trusted. So I, on a personal level, don't like this.
Jessica.
My concern was just on clarity on the one being a minimization component, which I understand that you wouldn't do both, but if you're looking at avoidance and minimization, would item one say the goal, right, is to require no more than 50%? Or is that a hard and fast, you get 50% of your property, move on? That's how they interact.
I think the way that it's written in New Smart Beach is it's a limit. We can't exceed the 50%.
I want to notice that storage volume, so it's not land area. I'm going to be doing all kinds of volume calculations and stage storage calculation. This is complicated code.
Could I ask a pragmatic question? I'm gonna come in for a site review and plan review with you, and I'm on board with avoiding and minimizing. What if I do a great job of that, but I can use more of my property and I can still achieve that goal? Or is that unlikely, or?
Well, every section of our code has a waiver provision, right? So wetlands, trees, all of these say, if there's, a hardship or a need for a waiver, there's a process for that. Right now, it's usually the Development Review Committee. It could be a different process in the future. But if there's some practical reason why the letter of this code doesn't apply, there's a way for an applicant to make that argument and potentially get a modification or a waiver.
So,
to answer your question, it would then be on them to say, you have avoided and minimized enough to our liking. It's very subjective at that point. And also the thing that you said about the 50%, we just passed something saying you had to avoid and minimize. So to me, it seems like 50% is all you're going to get, period. And then you have to avoid and minimize from there and bring it down from 50%. It's not saying you get 50% just off the top.
Jessica.
I'll make a motion that in light of the avoidance and minimization criteria we suggested for adoption, we skip subsection 1.
There's already a seconded motion.
So, am I putting the motion?
I have lost what the exact original motion was. I believe it was to approve as written. So, and that was seconded, and we're discussing it. Jack?
Yeah, but I have a procedural question because I no longer want to second that. I withdraw my second.
So we have a motion to accept Roman numeral 1 with sub Roman numerals 1 and 2 as written. And we have no second for that. Motion dies for lack of a second.
Sorry.
Now I make that motion. Do I have to restate it? Just that. In light of the avoidance and minimization that we directed staff to proceed with drafting, I'd like to skip subsection 1, not adopt this.
We have a motion by Jessica Gallo to skip subsection 1 of add compensatory storage criteria until we look at avoidance and minimization language, seconded by Donna Brosmer. Oh, I'm sorry, Michelle. Seconded by Michelle Wittig. Any more questions, discussion?
Yeah.
Jack's right.
There needs to be, I think there needs to be consideration as well to the agricultural element that was brought up. And I'm not sure that's part of the motion.
Are you saying go back and add that consideration to our general avoidance and minimization if we skip this one?
No, I'm saying if we're skipping this one and looking into it, that it should be included in the review.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. Yeah, so you're not, well, I shouldn't say that way. Are you proposing we bring this back for discussion, or you're just saying the avoidance and minimization criteria that we talked about earlier is sufficient? We don't need green number one. We're only approving number two.
I am saying
That's what you're saying?
item one, add compensatory storage criteria. So both the 50% and the 1.5 to 1. I am suggesting we skip those.
Skip, like not approve them or talk about them at another meeting with more information. I don't know what skip means.
I'm okay with more information, but not move forward at this time.
Okay, because when you first said it, I thought you meant not the required no more than 50%, but yes to 1.5 to 1.
Sorry, I'm using the big Roman numeral 1. Apologies.
So if it is bring back, we're skipping and bringing back next meeting, and I don't know what you're wanting me to bring to back exactly.
Board. I think that this could be captured in some extent in avoidance and minimization as goals and strategies and offsets. But I am not in favor of the 50% requirement or the 1.5 to 1 because it's not based on science. And I would like to review the impact of avoidance and minimization on agricultural lands.
So, since that we
Jack Benville?
No, I agree. I just wanted that clarification.
Okay, so to be clear, the motion is to skip this entirely, to remove it from our consideration. To be dealt with through the language that will support avoidance and minimization. And Michelle, are you still good with your second? Okay. Any additional comments, discussion, questions? All those in favor? Any opposed? Aye. Motion carries. I believe it was 3 opposing, correct? I'm sorry.
Oh, what's the fairly list?
Okay, do we? Yes, we have time to go into, I guess that's blue Roman numeral 2. I didn't
Yes.
realize they were color coded, sorry.
Okay, so this next one is to codify an existing policy that Clay referenced earlier in the meeting. That is requiring all new construction and substantial improvements within the floodplain to use stem wall, deep footings, or pier piles. And that would be identified within Division 7 and then the Chapter 22 for the building code divisions. This policy went into effect at April 1 of this year.
Does anyone have any question about this? John?
What's the relationship with the base flood elevation and these footings, pilings? I mean, I would think that's the key, right? We don't want water in the house, and that's your base flood elevation.
The stem walls, deep footings, and pier piles is really not so much as it relates to the particular structure and its flooding. It is more about the volume of space that it takes up versus mass grading. So right now, most developers in Volusia County will come in and regrade the existing site to bring up the house pad to the required elevation to get above the floodplain. And so you got that grading around that area that would potentially be conducted as well. In a stem wall, you're using basically the existing ground as it is. You're just putting in a retaining style wall and backfilling that and then pouring the slab over that. So your footprint of impact on the existing ground is much, much smaller. So
I understand.
So it negatively impacts the floodplain a lot less.
Yes, I understand. The question I think though is where is the base flood elevation?
Still the same.
It's still the same.
Correct.
All right.
Yeah.
It's not an exemption to the base flood elevation. By utilizing these construction methods, you still have to be above.
Yeah, you minimize your impact and therefore the amount of mitigation you have to do.
I would point out that, when you do stem wall,
Mhm.
and then you put a stem wall, say 4 feet, 5 feet up, and then fill it all in and tamp it down and put a slab on it.
Mhm.
That's not a whole lot different than coming in with a bulldozer and putting up dirt 4 feet, damping it out and put a slab.
Sure.
I mean, we're still doing the same thing to the site.
It's the side slopes.
Yeah. You know,
What you see is that the side slopes coming off. So if my existing site is at, say, 20 feet elevation, and I'm proposing to come in with 6 feet of fill, and I have a level area for my foundation, then I have to have a 6-to-1 slope off of that to the side of the property lines to meet the existing grade. So therefore, there is additional fill brought onto the lot. What we're attempting to do is to leave the existing natural grade as much as possible, with the fill only being limited to the area of the stem wall. Understood.
Along those same lines, that's a really good question. So you're saying the minimum is 6-to-1?
Typically-
3-to-1? Okay.
For a residential home, you don't want to walk off your back patio to a 3-to-1 slope and go
Okay.
head over tea
So it
kettle.
could be substantial, 6-to-1, if you're 4 foot up, 6-to-1, right? 24 feet all the way around is the additional fill in the floodplain.
Right.
So I would just ask about substantial improvements. If you have something that is already on that fill pad and you're just gonna do 51% of the thing, are you actually then going to make them take all that fill out of the floodplain?
It could be yes, that's an extreme option. Now, the thing about it is realize that if you're in the floodplain and you have a mortgage, you're going to have flood insurance. So the substantial improvement criteria gets amped up considerably. Because we just look at 50% of the damage that may be associated with. FEMA looks at a rolling 5-year period prior to. So realizing that what we're all trying to do with any of these substantial improvement standards is giving people reasonable use of their property that may be non-conforming, and trying to find what could be an acceptable method of addressing how to bring it into compliance. Rather than an amortization schedule, it's based on the value of the structure. And so therefore, we try and work with them to come up with these answers as best as possible.
I think the trouble you're going to run into is if the substantial improvement does not include a change to their foundation, and say the house is older than 1983, what are you replacing the existing grades to?
Right.
You're going to go out there and dig a bunch of dirt out. You don't know what the prior elevations were prior to that home being built. And I don't know that I don't know that you can make a reasonable adjustment to that, but
I mean,
the new construction certainly makes sense. The substantial improvements, especially if it does not include a foundation change, I would argue that's.
Well, right now, we're facing it over on the coast everywhere we go. Everyone who had slab on grade no longer can build slab on grade on the coast. I can tell you,
Right,
property.
what we're saying is if your substantial improvement doesn't include foundation, all you're doing is filling your existing foundation up, then I would say, look, you shouldn't have to convert to stone wall. But if you are making any adjustments to your stone wall or to your foundation, because you're changing the grade to make sure it doesn't flood in the future, then definitely at that point, any increases should be by stem wall, footing here from the grade of the site.
I can tell you that the example I'm thinking of with Ken Meister, he was going to rebuild just as is because the slab that he had from his home was still in place. But the level of improvements exceeded 50%. So you had to demolish the house and come back with pure construction. And that's a FEMA requirement.
He's changing his foundation.
He had to because he was substantially damaged, even though the foundation still remained in place. He was looking at all kinds of different options.
Other than Wendy.
So question for Clay on the 50% substantial improvement rule, I know it applies to damage reconstruction. What about if he didn't have a house that had been substantially damaged by a flood event and was coming in and wanted to do a remodel?
Remodel to, again, 50%. And just realize something. FEMA's rolling 5 years. This gentleman I'm talking about, 2 years prior to me, control coming in with about $200,000 in construction.
Well, but in general, that rule applies whether or not it's hurricane caused damage that's causing the improvement. It's regardless, right? Okay.
Yes.
So substantial improvements. I'm not sure that this is the most applicable thing. Let's talk new construction, because I think that's where this has more applicability. New construction requires us to build above the floodplain. We're going to be adding avoidance and minimization requirements. We have no adverse impacts to floodplains, so you're going to have compensation or mitigation requirements. And if you have a lot that has room for it, is this just telling people that they can't compensate for floodplain if they want to have the ability to step out of their house without having a ramp or stairs to the ground? Other than their front yard, so their side yard, their backyard, if they have a door that exits, if they're going to have a deck or something else, that they can't go dig compensating storage on their property to have that?
To a certain extent, yes. Because again, what we're striving to do is maintaining existing grades, as you see. Right now, I can take you a tour of down in Bethune Beach, where you see folks have wanted to have their home with a backyard that they could walk out with, and they've tried to put an 11-foot high retaining wall along the side property line of their neighbor, whose house is 5 feet away. So from that perspective,
I'm going to say, granted, there's going to be cases that this doesn't apply to. I'm thinking, Daytona Park Estates and some of our beachside communities and other places. You have 50, 60-foot lots that exist. You're going to have a challenge because of the vested rights. But if you have an acre or 5 acre, 10-acre parcel, and you're able to accommodate building out your home pad, I don't know, I'm seeing size as potentially a limitation on this rule, but below an acre, yeah, it's pretty reasonable. Above an acre, I start to question if maybe we're just limiting people's choice.
again, it's the committee's decision. If you don't feel that substantial improvements warrants this type of,
Oh, I'm just meaning new construction.
yeah, well, new construction, I would recommend that this is implemented right now, because the fact is, well, yes.
One thing to say here is that the council has really talked quite a bit lately about how do we get folks to maintain natural topography, right? And we talked about how low impact development does that on a voluntary basis. This is a way to maintain natural topography, which is you can build your house on there because you have a right to do so, but you don't have to fill the entire lot. Your neighbor doesn't have to live with this, wall of dirt next to them. So this is a provision that gets to that goal of the county council.
So let me just help me envision this for a subdivision. You've got, you're planning all your road, or you're designing your roads. The roads, do they have to be out of floodplain?
Yes.
Okay, so the
Yes.
roads
Yes.
definitely have to be out of floodplain. So you have to fill the floodplain up to 50% or. Is that true?
Yeah, that's still at 2% cross slope on a 2-lane, you're still have some water on there. It's not above the floodplain.
So no or yes?
Most of the
Yes.
water by not to about 3 inches.
Even if engineering doesn't require it, fire requires flood-free access, so that would be above.
Okay, so the roads are above, have been filled to above the floodplain. Then you have these depressional areas, and then each home of your driveway, it's probably got to be filled above the floodplain. And then each home is on a stem wall inside the development. So when you have a flood, the road is not flooded, the driveway is not flooded, the house is not flooded, but everywhere in between is. And that's what I think we're doing by doing this, right? And maybe that's okay. I don't know. I'm just picturing it.
I heard a lot of your flooding.
But it's important to say that's really not flooding. Is that true? Tad?
Said that.
Okay, yeah. If the yards flood, but the roads don't and the houses don't, that's really what we're trying to avoid, right?
Correct. Mimicking the existing condition as much as possible.
Goes back to the whole avoidance minimization criteria, right? Probably you're not gonna have an entire subdivision come in the floodplain and have what you just described, right? They're going to show that floodplain, hopefully it's even treed, they use their tree preservation area, they're gonna set that portion aside and maybe have one or two lots within there because they cannot avoid it at all. So it should not affect an entire development.
Well, when you're designing something and you have the floodplain all scattered around, it's very difficult to just say, okay, well, this road is gonna go through here, and because we gotta avoid the floodplain, you're gonna have a bunch of no loaded road or single loaded road, and then we'll only put our homes in the floodplain. No, you can't, because you gotta avoid and minimize. It's just very difficult to say, avoid and minimize as much of the floodplain as you possibly can, which is where we're headed with this. It's very difficult to design because we have a lot of floodplain out there, and some of it's only 2 or 3 inches deep. It's not deep floodplain, so it's super easy to compensate for it. So this is complicated stuff.
Ginger, you have your card up, comment? Ginger, you don't have your card up.
I do not remember. Maybe I am.
Would anyone like to make a bill?
Can I make a motion that we skip or just deny this, that we vote?
On the website. So
We were talking about making an ordinance.
Jessica,
So my understanding is right now it exists as an interpretation of an existing ordinance.
Correct.
Yes, as,
Okay, so it's an interpretation
yes,
of an existing ordinance.
yes. Based on conditions existing in unincorporated Volusia County where we have vested lots that are located in the floodplain, that the development of said lots has resulted in the perception of additional impacts on adjacent properties.
in other words, all the people coming in and saying that the
Yes.
construction next to them is flooding them out.
Yes,
So this is not to new subdivisions.
they're vested subdivisions. So they're subdivisions that may be in and may not have all of what we would normally, let's just cut to the chase. So the primary driving force is Daytona Park Estates, where you don't have any stormwater in place. You have very substandard roads out there in the first place. You have many older homes that were built prior to many of these requirements being in place. So we looked at that. We also have similar situations occurring throughout these infill lots throughout the county. Believe it or not, there's an area over between Holly Hill, Ormond Beach, off of US 1, where we had a building permit and we had to implement a similar situation because that was in the floodplain. So what you see are these lots where it's obvious that flooding has been occurring. It's obvious that bringing in additional fill will displace water. How can we minimize the displacement of that water from that lot onto the adjacent properties? Exactly.
Tyler,
So I think we do have a problem, that there may be a code solution that needs to be brought in place to address the idea of an 11-foot wall on your property line that your neighbor is filling. I think that we need to have some slope ratios similar to like air rights, what happens in cities like Manhattan, so that you don't have shading and other issues. But that's not what's in front of us. That's not the thing that I think we attack here. I think lots 1 acre and smaller, lots smaller than 1 acre makes sense because you don't have room for setbacks to your structure. When you get to a larger lot size, you have room for setbacks, so you can accommodate grading stitches, other things, and mitigate the impacts. But in somewhere like Daytona Park Estates or some of their subdivisions, which have a lot of smaller lots, there isn't a good solution. So I don't know, Bill, if you have a motion out, but my suggestion would be, or, I would make a motion that we move forward with this for lots smaller than 1 acre.
Could I include the substantial development or the substantial improvements?
Just new construction on lots smaller than 1 acre.
Okay. Tyler Melbourne has made a motion on point 2 that would be for all new construction, not substantial improvements, and lots of 1 acre or smaller, to have this as a requirement, stem wall, deep footings, or pier pile in floodplain. Do we have a second? Seconded by Dr. Ronna. Any discussion? Wendy?
I just want to reiterate Ginger's point from earlier, and in contrast to Tyler's perspective, is that we need to remember that floodplains are an ecosystem benefit. They provide ecosystem services that are valuable, that actually do good things for communities. And they're not just a nuisance to be filled and worked around and, and sort of accommodated in some other way. So, I mean, it's just two completely different perspectives here. And it's not a problem to be fixed. Floodplains are not a problem to be fixed. They're a benefit to be embraced. So.
Done.
Just a point, what's happening or has happened in Bethune is stem wall construction, except the stem walls are on the property line. And we fill it all in, and then we build on top of it. And one of my neighbor has an 8-foot wall facing my house, but she likes it.
So just to reiterate something, we are not talking about a widespread issue in unincorporated Volusia County. Well, we are. I mean, that map, the maps we looked at, looks like most of the counties are floodplain.
I think Clay's explanation of why this came about is the best description of why this is a problem. You got certain old developments that were designed, or probably not designed, were laid out prior to the modern stormwater rules from 1983, the Daytona Park Estates and so on, that created these lots that are nowhere near an appropriate elevation. They were never really mass graded. They were never set up or designed such that the stormwater has moved through. And that's the driving force behind a large portion of this, minimizing the impact in those areas for these people that have a vested right based on the county's rules to build on those lots.
So follow-up question, and I take it Tyler thinks of the floodplains as something we can engineer around and believes that is desirable. That's one viewpoint. And ergo the lot size of 1 acre or less. And I'm thinking into the future a little bit. I build my 5 acres, I build it up, I build my house, the 5 acres next to me, the 5 acres next to me, and all of a sudden we don't have a floodplain anymore that's viable. Dr. Anderson, what are the ecological services of the floodplain?
Again, you have to put that flood water somewhere. So we're not requiring, additional compensating storage, if the flowway, which you distinguished earlier, the floodplain versus the flowway, when the flowway fills up, it has to spread out to somewhere. And so if everybody has filled, that water is going to go somewhere, and it's likely going to go somewhere off the property that you own. So, no, is it not?
So the cost stream flooding, lake-based flooding, you have a volume of floodwater, you have volume of storage. If you fill your storage area, you expect the stage of the floodplain to rise. Riverine flooding, where you have a floodway, you have a capacity to convey a certain rate of water out of the floodway. You have hydraulic grade line that results from the frictional losses of that flow, which establishes the reach elevations of your floodplain. If you fill in at the reaches but you don't affect the floodway, you haven't changed the resulting capacity or resulting stage within that basin in most cases. When you get to really small floodways, really small ditches, which are not regulated floodways, it requires closer analysis because time and concentration becomes more of a factor. But when we deal with creeks, rivers, things of that nature, time and concentration is usually greater than a week. We're dealing with groundwater flows that are saturating them. And so we see that our engineered improvements, when engineered correctly, when we follow the procedures that are in place, they work. What we see a lot of times is that flooding is happening where it wasn't done correctly, it wasn't operated correctly, where there was some error. And rather than saying, we don't trust the science behind it, let's go after the errors. Let's fix the problems that's my perspective on it. And so from a floodplain, providing storage, there are other ways for us to deal with it, including just getting the water to the ocean. Depending on where you are, that would be the answer. Unless the ocean is your floodplain.
I think there's an assumption that if you're building in Daytona Park Estates or anywhere else on a vested lot in the county and you're filling in the floodplain, that you're providing compensating storage, and that's not true. You're not. On a new development, building a handyway or you're building a subdivision, you're providing compensating storage. If you're building your house in Daytona Park Estates and you're filling your whole lot, you're not providing compensating storage. That's just less floodplain.
What about the 5 acres? If she fills her 5 acres, she's required to provide compensating storage.
Nope.
Jessica.
So what if this subsection 2 was revised to make that a requirement unless full compensation was provided in accordance with whatever cross-section?
That's about the whole reason we're doing this is to stop gap because of the issues with impacts to the flow.
Right.
If you can show zero impacts to the flooding plain wasn't required, it's not necessary.
Jessica, would you like to restate Tyler's motion with your addition?
I actually have a point of confusion. Do we have no restrictions against fill in the floodplain on a vested lot when somebody comes in for a building permit, regardless of lot size or use type? Is Ginger's saying no?
Right now, we do not for a single family building permit within a vested subdivision require compensatory storage.
Regardless of size.
Correct.
And if I may, to that point, one of the, is it not now a law that in real estate you must disclose if your home is flooded? I mean, we have communal interest in not having homes flood out in our community and not creating more problems.
Yes,
Do we not?
there is a state law requiring that disclosure, but a lot of the flooding occurred outside of the floodplain too. So the simple fact is this, is that a lot of the floodplain management requirements, it presumes that subdivisions were created with the idea of compensatory storage already in place. And so therefore, there's not necessarily this idea that you would have a need to do compensatory storage for a single family lot. That's what we're trying to get back to, is trying to figure out how can we reasonably require specifically like infill subdivisions or vested subdivisions that were done prior to many of our stormwater regulations. How can we put in the most reasonable way of addressing it? Because if I ask for compensatory storage for a lot in Daytona Park Estates, I just took the property.
So the thing we talked about before, which is avoidance and minimization, that is not for vested lots, that's for new subdivisions?
That would be for everything, the avoidance and minimization that you had adopted today. That would be across the board.
So that may address some of the issues.
But there is not a compensating storage requirement as they were talking about. Compensating storage is not a minimum requirement of the NFIP. So federal regulations does not require compensating storage. It is done by local.
So we are, it's 4:04, so we're past our time. We have a motion right now for number 2 that would cover new construction and lots of 1 acre or less. And that was seconded. Based on discussion, we have an option to amend the motion or we can vote on it.
In previously entitled lots. Vested.
Okay.
So then all the footings or pure pile would be required for all new construction on lots of 1 acre or less that are vested. Is that what this is now, Tyler?
Yeah, I'm gonna make an amendment. So, instead of having a restriction on lot size, just say unless compensatory storage is provided for the floodplain impacts. That way, if you can provide it, you can get away from this rule. If you can't provide it, follow this rule.
Is that clear to everyone? Seconded by Donna. Any further questions, comments? All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. And we are adjourned.
Sorry, I had one other question.
Oh.
We can take it up next time, but think about this, maybe send me an email. Our meeting in July is July 2nd. I had one member say, maybe that's not a great week. We'll send out an email. And you guys can think about whether or not you want to have a meeting July 2nd. We do have a meeting on June 3rd, I believe, 4th. I'll be out of town. Keith and Samantha will be here.
And then we didn't get to modification of freeboard in the floodplain.
Yeah, so we'll do floodplain beginning next time and then start wetlands. Complete
you.
wetlands, yes.
Thank you.